saving for retirement, how stocks work, what mutual funds are, what a 401k is, what an IRA is, you name it. It's about all of these things so that hopefully you will be prepared and you'll make good choices, and someday you will not be, eating cat food. Which sadly, you hear these stories. You hope that doesn't actually happen, but you get the idea. Unless you like cat food. Maybe you like the taste of it. But unless you love it, hopefully that won't be too present. All right, now, I will preface all this by saying right off the bat that you should know that most people are extremely ill-prepared for life. That hopefully that's why you're here, because you realize that's true. Most people have nowhere near enough money for retirement. They don't save much, if anything, for college. If they do try to save some, they realize it's not nearly enough. And so one of the things I'm going to be showing you as we go through this is that time is probably the biggest thing that you have going for you. You're young. That means if you start doing things right now, and maybe not literally right now, but in other words, shortly after, say, you start working, you start doing things like saving for retirement, saving for whatever it is you need to save for, making good decisions about debt, things like that, you'll be way better off. This is not something that can wait. People who wait until they're in their 40s or 50s, which is not exactly that old, most people retire in their 60s, you're like, well, that's like halfway between now and when I'm going to retire. That's a good time to start. No, actually, it's not. As I was explaining a few minutes ago to one of my other classes, you start saving for retirement at 25, you only have to save about half as much per year as you do if you start at 35. And if you start at 45, you probably need 4, 5, 6 times as much. I'd have to double check the exact numbers, but it's definitely more than 4 times as much per year saved. And probably more like 5 or 6 times, I would guess. The amount that you have to save skyrockets. And without getting into too much detail on exactly why this is so, with the numbers, let me show you an easy way to think about it, okay? There's a rule called the rule of 70. And the rule of 70 says that if you're trying to figure out how long it takes for something to double in value, in other words, if you have compounding, something that compounds, it increases by 10%, and the next year, all of that increases by 10%, the next year, all of that increases. If you want to see how long it takes for something to double in value, what you need approximately, you just want to ballpark it, you need a number of years such that the interest rate times the number of years equals 70. That's a good approximation. So if your rate of return was about 7%, it would take about 10 years to double. A rate of return of about 10%, it would take about 7 years. Now, this is ballpark. It's not exactly right, but within the normal ranges of return, it's a pretty good way of ballparking this. So let me explain why this matters, okay? So let's say that you start at the age of, 25, and you're going to retire at 65. So you got 40 years of time, right? About 40 years in which maybe you're saving things. Take a look at what happens to the dollars that you put aside at age 25. Now, one thing you got to keep in mind is there's this thing called inflation that I'm sure you're aware of. Things cost more over time. $1 today is not worth as much as $1 tomorrow. Everything goes up in price. Does that make sense? Over the long term, a typical inflation rate is around 3%, although it's actually been lower in the last, 20 years, probably closer to 2% or something. But it varies. But long term, 3% is about right. Okay. An easy way to try to account for inflation, so you don't have to worry about how many dollars is this equal to 20 years from now? An easy way to think about it is just to knock 3% off the return rate. Does that make sense? So if you could get a 10% rate of return, where if you invest $1, it's worth 10% more, then if you just say that's sort of like getting a 7% return rate if nothing went up in price, that's a pretty good approximation. Does that make sense? That's pretty darn close. So let's say, hypothetically, we'll get way more into savings here in just a little bit, how it all works. But just to give you an idea of why it's so important you start early, let's say you get a return rate of 8%. Okay, that's actually a very reasonable long-term return rate. If you're investing in a variety of things like stocks and bonds, you can certainly do better probably. Let's say you did 8%. And let's say that that you knock the 3% off, right, because of the inflation. You say, ballpark it, you get about a 5% rate of return. Okay, adjusting for inflation and everything. It means it would take about 14 years. 14 times 5 is 70. Every 14 years, $1 that you invested today would be worth about twice as much as $1 is as it is currently. Even accounting for inflation, it would actually be more than $2. It might be $3 or something in 14 years, but that would be like $2 today, because everything would cost more. Does this make sense? Okay, now think about what this means. In 40 years, you would have gone through a doubling process almost 3 times. So from 2 to 4 to 8. your dollar might be worth almost 7 times as much now. See? On the other hand, if you put that dollar aside when you're 55 and only have a 10-year period, it's worth like $1.70 or maybe, or $1.60. It's going to take a lot of those dollars if you want to save enough. Does this make sense? Whereas if you start when you're really young, it doesn't take nearly as much. So time, as you're going to see, as we talk about a lot of this stuff, especially the savings piece of it, is going to be incredibly crucial. Incredibly crucial. That's why the amount it's going to take is going to skyrocket as you get older. So you can't wait. This isn't one of those things you're like, oh, I'll worry about it when I'm 40. It's too late. It's too late then. You got to worry about it when you're younger. All right, we got a whole bunch of topics we can address, and now we're going to go through all of them. What would you guys like to talk about first? So if you take a look here, we can just sort of go in order, or we can jump around. So I've got a bunch of major topics listed. I've got while in college, student loans, credit cards, credit history and score, taxes, buying, owning a house, and savings and investment, you name it. We got a lot of things. Should we just maybe kind of start at the beginning? Maybe we'll start with the college piece. Let's start there. Okay? So, you know what? I'm actually just going to kind of proceed then. I'm not going to just read off of this, but let's kind of proceed as this does. This will at least give me some reminders and key points. So first, again, general thoughts. This is going to be a gigantic 10,000 foot overview. We're going to dive into the details. But 10,000 foot overview, really big picture. The best things you can do are like figure out whenever you get a job, like how much can I afford to spend? So in other words, kind of figure out so that you're not just flying by the seat of your pants. You need to know how much you can afford before you go spend it. You don't spend money you can't afford. Okay? If you're going to save money, and as you're going to see, you're going to want to save a lot, you take that off right off the bat. If you don't pay yourself first, meaning put the money aside before you start spending your money, you will spend it all. That's what's going to happen. Okay? That's what will happen. If all of your money goes into your checking account and it doesn't immediately then have a portion go somewhere else, you will spend every dime in all likelihood and you will save nothing. That's like 98% of Americans, right? Okay. So what you want to do is essentially take whatever it is you figure out you need to save, and that needs to come out right off the bat. And a lot of times when we get into details, there's ways for that to happen. For example, we'll talk later about things like 401ks, but that's something that if you have an employer, it's a retirement savings account, and or it's really an investment account, not a savings account. And the idea is you tell them how much you want taken out of your paychecks, and it comes out and immediately gets put somewhere else. You never actually get that money. Does that make sense? It's sitting in a special account. That's for most people, they don't have enough discipline to not spend the money if it's in their account, available to spend. So that's probably preferred, something like that. Okay, but we'll get into all those things later. All right. After you've figured out what you're going to save, you take it off the top, then you got to allocate money towards the essentials. Things like food, housing, transportation, the stuff that are absolutely essential. Okay, before you go have essentially your fun money. You got to pay for those. You spend all your money having fun and then can't pay your rent, you're not going to have a lot of fun, right? Living on the street's not going to be a lot of fun. You're going to be very surprised by how much seemingly little things add up. It will stun you how much money will go into that. It's an enormous quantity of money for little things. The bottom line here is you got to plan, put the money aside for yourself first. Don't spend money if you don't have it. Okay, we'll get into this a lot more. 10,000 foot approach, right? We'll delve into why this is true. If you plan to ever someday comfortably retire, you're probably going to want to put at least 10% of what you make every year into savings. Where that's not, and as I'm going to tell you probably more. We'll get into that later. So most people aren't even getting close to that. They're putting a couple percent, if that, and that's why they never get close. That's why they're in bad shape. It's not a small percent. It's a large chunk. Okay? Think about that. You might be like, 10%? That's like so much. But keep in mind, you're going to work for maybe 35, 40 years, and then you're hoping to retire for another 30 years. So you got to put enough aside in other words, about 60% of your life after you get out and you start working. From there on, 60% of your life is maybe spent working, and the other 40, if you hope, right, if you can retire someday, then you're going to spend a considerable fraction where you don't have to work. Well, the only way to have enough set aside that you can actually afford to live off the stuff is to put a significant amount down, right? You should just be happy you're not having to put 40% aside. And that's because when you start early, right, it builds in value. You wait till later, this 10% is more like 25% or something. And then it reaches the point where you can't even do it. You're putting every dime you can and you can't get there. So that's why you got to start when you're young. Okay, let's keep going. Managing debt. You got to be very careful about things like credit cards, and we'll talk about that. That's where most people run into issues. And you got to learn some very, very, very basic ideas. Like if you got various types of debt, like you got some student loans, and you got a mortgage on a house, that's basically your loan for your house, and you got credit cards, you generally speaking want to pay off whatever has the highest interest rate first, right? That's the way that works. Seems fairly obvious, right? You got 14% on your credit card, you got 7% on your student loan, you got 4% on your mortgage. The mortgage is the last thing you're going to pay anything extra on. You're going to pay your basic payment. You're not going to try to pay that off faster. Does that make sense? Okay, and we'll get into that more in a minute. Okay. All right, automobiles, they're not investments. There are a few exceptions, right? If someone is literally into like classic cars or something and it's truly an investment, an automobile is not an investment. It's a cost. That's all it is. It's a cost. Okay? The second you buy it, it loses value. Every single day, it loses more value. That's all it is an expense. Never buy a car thinking, oh, I'm going to buy this and now it's got all this value. No, it's a cost, right? It's a cost. The more it costs, probably the bigger the cost is to you. It'll probably, if you buy a $50,000 car, you're going to incur more cost. Does that make sense? It may retain a little more value, but the actual cost will be more. A car is an expense. That's all it is. It's an expense. There's a whole bunch of costs. We'll go through these things too, like car insurance, tax. You guys are probably somewhat more familiar with this, that are rather expensive as well. So a car is not going to just boil down to, hey, what does it cost to have the car? You probably double that to get your actual cost when you include everything else, like auto, like repairs and gasoline and what have you. But the point is, it's a lot higher than you might think. Okay, homes are a different story. Homes usually will increase in value if they're well maintained, but they can drop, right? Short term especially, they can absolutely drop in value, and they sometimes do. Long term, they'll usually go up in value, but I think a mistake a lot of people make is they view their home primarily as an investment, and it's not. Okay, I would say that's not a good way of viewing it. You should look at a home as a place to live, and the investment is a secondary benefit. Because the reality is you can't guess with a high degree of certainty which homes are going to be worth way more in the future. If you could, everyone would just go buy those as investments. Does this make sense? Okay, and as we're going to get into this more a little bit later, either today or another day, there's a lot of costs associated with homes. It's not just you buy the house. You got property taxes, you got maintenance, there's tons of costs, right? The cost of having a house is way more than the cost of paying for just the mortgage. That's your loan, basically, pays for your house. It's way higher. Okay, and we'll go into this in more detail. But if your mortgage was, $1,200 a month, you might actually spend $2,000 a month in total cost for having a house or more. Yeah.
So, do you suggest financing a house at a different rate or doing a...
Yeah, we'll get into that in a minute. I would say almost everyone is going to need to finance, and obviously the interest rate plays a big role. The lower the interest rate, the better. But again, you can't control that, right? The rates are whatever they happen to be. Sometimes you get lucky and the rates are really low. Sometimes you're unlucky and they're pretty high. You can try to wait it out until they get lower, but who knows how long that takes. They've been quite low for a very long time, but there's been times in history where they were quite high. So for a very long time, they've been quite low. You can always refinance. If you get a much higher, if you get a rate of 6%, I don't think rates are close that high right now, but historically, that's not a particularly high rate. The last 10 years, that would be a high rate, I think. But say you got a 6% rate, and then 5 years later, something's happened and the rates are really low and they're 4%, then you can refinance at that point. And a lot of times people do that. Okay. But the bottom line here is homes have lots and lots of price associated with them. They do serve as an investment, but don't view it primarily as that because there's all these other costs you're not even thinking about, right? They're not primarily an investment. They're secondarily an investment. Does that make sense? Hopefully you accrue equity. If you buy and sell your house every 3 or 4 years, you're just throwing money out the window. Every time you buy and sell a house, there's enormous fees that you pay. For example, if you use a realtor to sell your house, usually realtor fees are about 6% of whatever the value of the house is. So say your house is $300,000, that's $18,000 in fees right off the bat. Now you can negotiate maybe a little bit lower price, but usually you're paying a significant portion. You get the idea. Those are just fees. And then when you buy another house, guess what? There's fees for that one too. And then when you take out a mortgage, there's fees for that. So if you're going to buy a house, you want to buy a house you're going to keep for a while, right? You have to be able to justify basically incurring those fees by holding the house for a while. It's not going to accrue it enough for you to make any money off of it, even as an investment. If you go sell it in 3 years, you're just going to always be in the hole. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, so these are just big pictures. All right, let's start delving into the details now. All right, college, meal plans, right? So how many people are going to colleges where they say you have to have a meal plan? Anybody have those where they're mandatory? Okay, how many of you like, almost everyone gets one, but they're not mandatory? That's probably most colleges, freshman year at least. Okay. So what I'm going to tell you is that usually meal plans are rather expensive. They're not as expensive as like eating out at, a medium-priced restaurant or something. But like compared to cooking for yourself, they're going to be fairly high. But they're extremely convenient. I would say for most people living on campus, a meal plan makes sense, but you should pick one that fits how often you're going to use them. Lots of people go to college and they get like the full meal plan, and then it's like 3 meals a day, and then they use like one a day. That was kind of dumb, man. Sometimes there's flexible ones where you can choose the number of meals, and so pick kind of wisely on that. Sometimes you actually have a set dollar figure instead of it being like, hey, you get 3 meals a day. Sometimes it's you get X amount of money. Okay, so if you have that, then obviously you have a little more flexibility. You got to be careful because if you show up and you've got X amount of money per month and you spend all the first 2 weeks, you have no more money to eat off of. And maybe you're lucky enough that mom and dad say, hey, no big deal, we'll send you more money, and then maybe not. Maybe mom and dad don't have more money, or maybe they're just like, yeah, you should have spent your money better. So be a little careful if you have one of those. Okay, you use all this stuff up. Usually it's probably by the semester the way it's designed, so you don't want to use it all up too early. All right, housing. Okay, on campus versus off campus. So a lot of people get this itch to move off campus after the first year. I would say at most colleges, and it differs college by college, but probably the most typical setup is someone goes to college, they live on campus for a year in a dorm, and then they move off campus. That's probably what happens most of the time. Some schools you have to be on campus. Some you have to be there for 1 year. Some you have to be there for 2 years. Some schools are more commuter schools. People come back and forth. I would recommend living on campus for the first year, because that's where you meet people. That's essentially where you socialize and where you're going to meet new people and where you're going to find people to go out and do things. Your social life will not be nearly as good if you don't live on campus. Now, I'm talking in generalities, right? In generalities, there's always exceptions to that. But you're going to miss out on a lot of the college experience if you're not on campus that first year. After that, it's not quite as important. Now, here's the difference. When you have campus housing, it's usually paid up front sort of for the semester. Sometimes you can do it in a couple of installments. But it's a lot different than, say, if you have an apartment and every month rent is due, right? It's not the same setup. Oftentimes, you just pay it all at the beginning of the semester, or you kind of pay it in a couple of chunks. Does that make sense? Kind of like tuition. Okay? Now, here's the good news of that. If you have the chunks up front, like, for example, maybe you're like me and you're pretty poor and you go to college, but you get a lot of financial aid. So the money comes in, here's the cost to pay for school and so forth. Then the good news is right off the bat, your housing's paid for. So even if you make dumb choices the rest of the semester, at least you have a place to live, right? Whereas if you're paying by the month and you make some dumb choices and spend all your money, then you can't pay your rent and you're in big trouble. So that is an advantage. The other advantage to the on-campus housing is that it's typically not for a full year. Like it's just for the school year. Does that make sense? So you're only paying for 9 months or 10 months. Whereas if you get an apartment or something, you're usually paying for a whole year. Most of the time, you're going to pay for a year. Does that make sense? Just imagine you're someone who lives in a college town, you have a rental property, you're not going to let someone sign up for 10 months. That's going to sit there for 2 months. So you're going to say, no, you're going to sign a 1-year lease. There's exceptions. But in many cases, you're like, no. I have something that you all want. I have a place next to campus, so I'm going to price it pretty high, and you're going to rent it for a whole year. The other difference is if you go get your own place, they're probably going to ask you for a bunch of things like first month's rent, maybe first month's and last month. This depends on the location. But it's not like you just sign your lease and then when it's time, to pay your rent for that month, then you go pay it. It's like, no, before you get here, we're going to need a security deposit. We're going to need first month and last month. Remember the first time I had one in college, it ended up being like almost 3 months worth of stuff that you had to give them almost up front, right? And so you need a big chunk sometimes at the very beginning because they're not going to let you just sign a lease without anything usually. Does that make sense? Okay, you're going to have to give them all this other stuff, which, by the way, you can lose. So the last month rent is so, if the last month, what's holding you there, you're going to go somewhere else anyway, they're already paid. They've already got it. The security deposit is so that, if you beat the place up and it's in bad shape, that $500 or $800 or $200 or $1,000, whatever it is, they can keep it. So if you leave and you didn't clean the place or whatever, you did some other things, they just keep the money. And some people who who rent out places are really good about that. And if you do a good job and it's all in good shape, they give you your security deposit. Some are notoriously bad and just keep it anyway and make up some story, right? There's bad landlords and good landlords. There's also a danger if you live off campus, because a lot of people will not just have a place to themselves, they'll sign on to an apartment with several other friends, right? So you go through your first year and then you got a whole group of friends. There's like 5 of you. You're like, it's going to be great. We're going to rent this house and everyone will pay $700 a month and together we'll share this house. And here's what happens. The person who rents that house says, yeah, you're all going to sign on. You're all responsible for the entire rent. So if your friend, Sam decides, I'm dropping out of school, guess what? Everyone else is kicked out of the house unless they come up with the extra money or find someone else, right? They're not going to say, well, that person decided not to go. You all just keep paying the same amount and I'll just lose the money that I was supposed to be getting. So you're responsible for everybody else usually. So you got to be very careful, right? Because if you sign up with a whole bunch of other people, I can't tell you how many times someone drops out of college and they leave basically their housemates out there having to pay for everything. So be very careful about that piece of it. Okay. Financial aid stuff. Okay. You're going to need FAFSA if you want to do things like loans typically. This is also important if you're going to get things like, if you don't have a lot of money and you might qualify for Pell Grants, if you're relatively poor, it comes through this. A lot of schools will just require you to fill out FAFSA, or they'll tell you should do it, right? So this is usually a requirement to get financial aid. You also, for some schools, will have their specific applications. A lot of them will say, hey, we've got our very own application. It's the University of Texas at Austin application. It's the WashU, whatever it is. It's their application. And then especially private colleges will often have another thing you have to fill out that has a lot more detail than the FAFSA. That's called, it used to be called the CSS profile. I don't know if that's still the name. That was the name like 20 years ago. But anyway, it's got lots of detailed information. They want to know like everything. And it's not your information, it's you and your parents' information. They don't want to know everything. Every account your parents have, how much have they made for the last 3 years, how much do they have in savings here, what do they pay for this, everything, okay? You also need tax returns from usually at least the previous year, sometimes more than 1 year. And if you don't give them all this stuff, they will not calculate your financial aid package, right? And you will not qualify for financial aid. Some places might be nicer, and if you're late, they go ahead and let you qualify, but they may be done giving out the money at that point, right? So you need to do this, and you got to do this every year. This is not a one-time thing, right? When I was in college, every single year there was a deadline, and you knew what it was. Maybe it's March 15th or whatever it is, or February, whatever it was. You always had to get all those things turned in, or you're going to be out of luck next year. Now, if parents are paying for everything, maybe this is not as important. But for a lot of people, they at least have loans and so forth, so they still need to apply. Okay, a couple of tips here. In college, try to budget a little bit. That's a hard thing to do, but at least have some idea. If your tuition, housing, food is not paid in full at the beginning, you better put some of that aside, right? If you're living on campus and you're going to have a meal plan and all that stuff gets pulled out right at the outset, then at least you know you have a place to live and your food's taken care of. But if that's not your situation, then you better try to make sure some money's there, because you don't want to get into the 3rd month of the semester and then figure out you don't have any rent or food money. That's very bad, right? You do not want that situation. Okay, credit card debt. This is a giant issue for college students. I don't know if it's as big an issue now as it was when I was in college. They hand them out like candy. You show up as a freshman and there's like always stands for credit cards. Here, come sign up for a credit card. We'll give you a free t-shirt. We'll give you a free this. And you sign up and you're like, hi, I'm 18 years old. I'm unemployed. I just took out $10,000 in loans. I'm like, that's great. Here's a $1,000 credit limit. And then you pay it like $20 a month for a few months or whatever, the minimum as you read. And they're like, now you have a $5,000 limit. And then it's like, now you got a $10,000. Before long, you're like, why are you giving me all this credit? I have no income. And people would get into tremendous debt, right? And then you get to this point where it's like, I have an $8,000 worth of credit, and the monthly payment on that is like $60 a month, which won't even hardly pay for it. So the balance never drops virtually. Does that make sense? It's like you're never going to pay it off. And you're just paying fees. And anyway, you gotta be careful. Credit cards can get you in a lot of trouble. But they can be a lifesaver too. Now, we'll talk a lot more about credit cards later. If you are to the point in your life where you have, you're very stable financially, and you can use credit cards the right way, they can be fantastic. Like I almost always use credit because I incur zero finance fees. I actually get rewards. I make money off using the credit cards, right? But that's not going to happen if you're the college student with no income, right? Instead, you're going to be getting absolutely destroyed by all the fees and so forth. So anyway, we'll talk about these. They're not necessarily bad, right? They're actually very good if you use the right way when you're older. And you're basically more stable financially. All right, so let's see. Everything's going to be way more than you think. Meet all your deadlines. And then car on campus, you really want to be careful about this because a lot of times it's hard to park. Cars have lots of expenses associated with them. And then usually, like I said, it's just hard to park them. It's hard to find parking. You have to pay for parking. But they do often add a lot to your life. But as a freshman, a lot of places, they're really not essential. If you're living on campus, you probably don't need it. If you're living off campus, that's when it starts becoming more essential. If you're commuting, obviously, that's a different story. You probably have to have that. Okay, on we go. All right. Student loans. Done, done, done. Okay. Different types of loans. Now, the information here I gathered about 2 years ago. They might have tweaked it a little. It's probably still pretty close to right. I didn't have a chance to update this one. So you've got federal loans. This means basically they're backed by the federal government. Again, this may have been tweaked a little, but I think it's still close to accurate. The idea is with federal loans, the federal government tells various folks out there, hey, if you'll offer these types of loans, then we'll sort of guarantee the loans is what happens. So these loans are available. You may not get your loan from the government. You may get it from some bank, but it's through these programs. Okay? So there are loans that are called subsidized, and there are loans that are called unsubsidized. There's a very important distinction. Okay? A subsidized loan, which is what you want, is the kind of loan where it accrues no interest while you are still in school. Does that make sense? You take out a $5,000 loan, the day you graduate, it's $5,000. All of the interest that in theory is accruing while you're in school is getting paid. That's why it's a subsidized loan. Not by you, it's being paid, it's sort of waived, paid by the government. An unsubsidized loan is one that accrues interest while you're still in school. So as a freshman, you take out a $5,000 loan, 4 years later you graduate, that's now a $6,000 loan. Let's say, I'm using a random, or $5,500, whatever, it's accrued some interest. It's more than it used to be. Depends on what the interest is. Does that make sense? Okay, so it's actually becoming a bigger loan over time, even before you graduate. Okay, now typically these have fixed interest rates. When I looked them up a few years ago, the ranges were from 3.4 to 6.8%, but that depended on the year. So that they sort of tweaked the interest rates. I think they sort of may have more set in place recently, maybe set at 6.8%, but it used to be that they could have a big range. They changed it. I was really lucky because back when I was in school, they changed a lot, and you could lock them in. You could take all of your different loans from like all your years, and you could combine them, called consolidation, where basically they pay off that loan and give you one larger loan that covers it, and maybe you pay like a small fee, $50 or $100 to do it, but it locked in your rate. So if interest rates were really low right then, right, on a lot of your loans, which were variable, you could lock them in. So I locked in a bunch of loans at like 3%, 2.5%. Like that's like inflationary rate. I'll pay that off forever. They could give me a 1,000-year loan at 2%. I will take that because a dollar today is worth more than $1 at 2% is in a year. Like it's stupid low. Does that make sense? Stupid low. Now you got 6 or 7% interest. That's a different story now. That's a different story. I think that's where they're at now. Is around that range. Okay. All right. Now in terms of how much you can borrow, it's not an unlimited amount. And these programs are usually caps. And you'll notice this was like $3,500, $4,500 freshman, sophomore. It usually goes up. There's typically a yearly limit and then an aggregate limit. So over your entire time as an undergrad, you can only take out X amount. And there's limits for both these subsidized and the unsubsidized, and then sometimes for the combination of the two. So this is not an infinite well of money. Like there are limits to this. Does this make sense? Okay. Now, in addition to these, there are private loans. Private loans usually have much worse terms. This means Citibank says, all right, you fill out an application for a loan and we'll look at your situation and we might loan you some money. Typically, they're going to loan out at a higher interest rate. Typically, it's going to accrue interest while you're still in school. These are not preferred, right? You typically don't want these unless you have to have them. Oftentimes, these become essential if you go to an expensive graduate program. You're not getting, say, a PhD. PhDs, things that are often paid for. Let's say you decide to get an MBA or a law degree or something like that, or a medical degree, where the expense is very, very high and they know you're going to make a lot of money probably someday. They're going to have an extremely high tuition and you're going to take out a whole lot of loans. This is usually what happens. Okay? They figure you'll pay $200,000 for your 3 years now, So you'll get out and you'll make 200 grand a year or what have you. And so it's just an investment in your future. But you're going to need some of these because there's not going to be enough of this in a lot of those programs. Okay, how does repayment work? So let me give you an idea. So 10 years is a standard repayment period for federal loans. If you have a really enormous amount of debt, like if you go to graduate school and take out $100,000 or something, they'll let you have a longer period of time, 20 years, 30 years, depends on how much you have. But I want to give you an idea of what this boils down to. $37,000 was the average student loan debt for 2016 graduates. Every year it goes up somewhat. Does that make sense? This gives you a ballpark idea. You can guess right now it's probably around $40,000. That's average. Some people have a lot more, some have a lot less. This is just for an undergraduate degree. Okay? Now, $392 is the monthly payment on that at a 5% interest rate. Current rates are actually a little higher than that. So I would say most people would be a little over this, $400 and something a month. That's for $37,000. Okay? That's kind of like a car payment. It's kind of like buying a not incredibly expensive car, like a mid-range price car. You should ballpark it at about $100 per month for 10 years for every $10,000 borrowed. That's a reasonably good approximation. So if you take out $50,000 and you pay them off over the standard 10 years, you can expect to pay about $500 a month, somewhere around there. Does that make sense? Okay? This is a sizable chunk of money. I have a lot of people who ask me, should I be willing to take out student loans, right? Or is this something that I should absolutely avoid at all costs? And the answer is, it depends. The reality is, for a lot of people, paying for college is not something they could ever do unless they took out loans. And let's say you're planning to become a computer science major, and you're going to go to a good program, and in order to get that degree, you're going to take out $60,000 in loans. But the graduates are making $100,000 a year. Well, that's a pretty good investment in yourself, right? Over 10 years, paying $600 a month to have a $100,000 job is probably a very good investment. On the other hand, if you take out $60,000 or $70,000 so you can get a job making $30,000 a year, that's probably a very bad investment, right? So it very much depends on how much you're going to make out of your job and in other circumstances. This is not a great, everyone always says, how much should I cap it at? And there isn't a really good answer to this. It all just depends. I told someone as a ballpark in the mid-range, the normal ranges, expected salary minus $10,000 is probably a good upper limit. You don't want this amount. This is like, I don't want to do more than that, right? If I had to, I would go to that, but that's really not even perfect, right? So if you're an engineer expecting to make $80,000 a year, maybe up to $70,000, you'd be like, all right. The reality is you could probably justify more. You'd really like to not get close to that. You'd like to have less. Does that make sense? You want it to be much, much, much lower if you can. If you're going to go to graduate school and you're not getting something like a PhD, say if you go and get an MBA, a law degree, you're going to take out loans probably. In all likelihood, you're going to take out 6 figures or more. But you can easily justify it. Like my wife and I went to law school now a long time ago. I look back and it's been 15 years, right, since we graduated. And we both graduated with 6-figure debt from law school. But it was a heck of a good investment, right? It was a really good investment because we made enough money to cover probably in about our first year of working, we made as much as our debt was. And over, 6 years of working, we probably made 8 times or something. I mean, the point was it was a really, really good investment. Does that make sense? But we got jobs that paid really well. And the way you got those jobs from law school was to go to really good law schools that were very expensive and do well there. And so it was like, okay, we kind of understood the setup going in. I will tell you, there are some people, though, that went to the same law schools, and sometimes just bad luck happens. The economy tanks, and now no one's hiring, and they have $150,000, $200,000 debt and a lousy job or no job. So, yeah, you can't control everything. You try to make good choices, but some things are out of your control. But I would not say that loans should be completely out of the question for people. It all depends on your circumstances. For me, they were really essential. I would have not been able to have a better life probably without them. Well, I say that. I mean, I had some scholarship offers. I could have gone for a full ride somewhere, but it would have certainly changed my situation. Yeah.
So subsidized loans are so much better than unsubsidized loans. Are there like stipulations that force people to still take out?
Well, that there's limits. So what happens is you only need a small amount. Typically, you get a subsidized loan. Right? Obviously, you get an unsubsidized loan. No, pardon me, a subsidized loan, the ones you want. If you need more, like let's say that you really need $8,000 a year, and you're a junior, and they say you can only get $5,500 and subsidized, then you might have to take out another $2,500 in the unsubsidized. So that's the issue, is that there's a limit to these things. I'll also note here that you got to be careful with this stuff. Federal loans are not dischargeable in bankruptcy. So do you guys know what bankruptcy is? Okay, it's like there's a legal system in the U.S. that says that you can file for bankruptcy. Bankruptcy basically says that your net worth is negative. You have more debts and liabilities than you have assets, right? You owe more than you have. That's like filing for bankruptcy. And when you do that, there's a legal system that will basically discharge your liabilities. Liabilities are things like credit card debts and what have you. They say, okay, there's these things you owe, you can't pay them. So if you'll pay this little bit towards these things and you do these various things, then you'll no longer owe any of these things. Now, as we'll get into a little bit later when it comes to like credit history, your credit history will take a giant hit if you file bankruptcy, right? Credit history is going to basically tell people who might lend you money in the future if you're a good bet, if they should lend you money. And if you have really lousy credit, they're not going to want to lend you any money, or they'll lend it to you with very bad terms. So if you want to buy a house, you don't want really bad credit. If you want to buy a car, you don't want really bad credit, right? You want good credit. But there's still an advantage. If you're in a really terrible position financially, bankruptcy can be a lifesaver, right? You made up really bad choices. You got 20 grand in credit card debt. You're never able to pay it off. You got all these other things. Bankruptcy will discharge all of that. You can only file bankruptcy every so often. I think it's every 7 years, something like that. But here's the thing. Federal loans are not dischargeable. You file bankruptcy, they do not go away. They're there for your whole life until you die, or you pay them off. They do get discharged in debt, so they don't go on to like your whoever follows you on. They don't get passed down in your estate, right? But until you die or you pay them off, they are there. They cannot just be discharged like other debts can be. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. Now, you guys have any questions on this? I'm going kind of fast. You guys have any questions on student loans? Okay. When it comes to things like the private loans, you usually have to have reasonably good credit for those. So, if you're applying for, you may not even have to have credit, but you don't want to have bad credit. It's like if you're applying for a bunch of private loans, you're going to grad school and your credit's terrible, they may not lend you the money. You may not be able to go. If you're applying right out of school and so you have no credit and you're going to a good law school, they'll probably give you loans. But if you've already been out working for years, you run out of all this debt and you never paid it, and no, they're probably not going to give it to you. So they do look at your credit for the private loans. Federal loans, they don't really look at your credit, but if you get into default with the government, meaning you're supposed to start paying those loans and you didn't, then they won't lend you any more money. So say you go to school for 2 years and then you're like, well, I've kind of burned out, I'm going to drop out. And then you have no income and you just don't pay your loans. Then you're like, no, I want to go back. You may have a hard time paying for it. A lot of times there are ways to eventually get out of that position, but you have to work out a deal with them where maybe over a year you can start making payments and then they'll ignore all that and anyways, it causes problems. A lot of people have those very issues where they took out some and then they made bad choices or what have you, and then they need more to go back to school and then they can't get them anymore. The old ones don't disappear though, they're still there. So now they're working at Brahms and they still have $30,000 in debt. Okay, on we go. Now, all right. Credit cards. All right, so the idea of a credit card is that it's essentially providing what's called a line of credit that can be used to make purchases. Most of you probably have some idea how this works. So, all of that stuff you're accruing is typically due over a monthly billing cycle. So at the end of that month, let's say you've incurred $300, you owe them $300, right? If you don't pay off the $300, then you start paying interest. So most of the time with credit cards, you don't accrue interest on whatever you accrued in this most recent cycle. So if I'm in the current cycle, I haven't gotten the next bill, and I bought something a week and a half ago that was $27, there's no interest on that $27, as long as I pay it off as soon as the bill comes. Does that make sense? Whatever is in that last cycle, you usually don't pay interest on it until you fail to pay it off. Does it make sense? Now, if you don't pay it all off, then you get charged a finance fee, basically interest. So if you have a credit card and say it's 12% a year, it's about 1% a month, it means about every month, whatever you owe goes up by about 1% in value. So if you owe $300, now that's $303 next month. See how this works? Okay. If it was $3,000, that's $330. If that's $10,000, that's $10,100. That's without you buying anything else. And the problem that you run into is a lot of times with your credit card, they kind of sucker you in with a low introductory fee. They'll be like, you can get the credit card for 1.9% introductory. And that means for the first 6 months or year, you get a 1.9% interest rate. After the first year, it's now 17.9% or something like that. Okay, some credit cards have much better rates than others. Credit cards, if you're going to get one, the idea is you want one that has a low rate. A lot of them also have yearly fees. Like you have to pay an annual fee of $100. Every year you pay $100 for the privilege of having the car. Some have no annual fees. Some have bigger fees, some have smaller. What you want is no fee or low fee. You want one that has a fairly low interest rate, and ideally you want to pay it off every month, right? That's the idea. They're really good for convenience. It's really nice to just not have to carry money around with you everywhere and be able to have the convenience. The problem is it's also really easy when you don't have any money and you have an $8,000 line of credit to just go buy stuff that you don't really need, and then you can't pay for it, and then it just starts stacking up. Now, the other thing is if you miss a payment, okay, so what does that mean? Well, let's say you owe $1,000, and you get your bill, and the bill says you only have to make a minimum payment of $30. Okay, it's not going to say you owe $1,000. It'll say you owe $1,000. They say the minimum monthly is $30. Okay, what that means is you pay $30, you're doing okay. You still owe $970 plus interest on that $970. Now, if you fail to make your payment on time, like the payment date is January 22nd, you pay on January 27th, you just incurred a $30 fee for a late payment. And we automatically change your interest rate from 9.9% up to 19.9%. A lot of times the interest rate will immediately trigger to a higher rate as soon as you miss. Does that make sense? So you got to make sure that you're paying things when they're due, or the interest rate skyrockets. And you get fees on top. And this is how you just start snowballing all of these things together. Right? You start spending money you don't have, you can't pay it, you miss some payments, interest rate skyrockets, it's all building interest, you're incurring fees, and suddenly you owe way more money than you could ever pay for. Now, a lot of these credit cards have reward systems, like cashback, airline miles. I will tell you, this is a great example. So around here, you have Costco's, and they have credit cards, Sam's has one too, and they offer you something like 4 or 5% back when eating out. 3% or 4% or something on gas. It changes. The point is a substantial amount of cash back. You may wonder, how do they do this? Well, when you go to a restaurant or somewhere and use your credit card, that's a service to that company. They don't let Macy's allow credit card usage for nothing, right? They'll tell Macy's, you got to pay us 6% or 7 or whatever of anything that gets spent. So if $1 gets charged there, you owe us 6 cents on that, right? What that really means is the cost gets passed on to customers. Everything costs more because of the convenience of credit cards. Now, people who don't have credit cards still pay the extra amount. People with credit cards are sort of shifting the cost onto the people who don't have credit cards, right? Because they're helping pay the cost. Now, what ends up happening is you sort of get a kickback, a very legal kickback in a sense, if you have one of these rewards cards. Because say you get 4% for eating out, right? You go to a restaurant, and the restaurant has to pay 6% to, MasterCard or whatever. But then MasterCard sends 4 cents to you at the end of the year for every dollar that you spend. See? They encourage you to use their credit card because you're getting to spend a lot on it, because then you get a lot back, but then they get more fees. So what this means is if you can actually pay off your credit cards on time so you never incur any interest, and you have very low yearly fees, and you get really good rewards, you can make a lot of money off them. Like I say, my wife and I pay almost everything with credit cards if we can, pay them off on time. So we probably have averaged between $500 to $1,000 in net gain off the credit cards from cash back, basically, by just paying for everything we can, right? So when you net how much we pay in various fees or whatever, once every 2 years you forget, you make a late payment, and there's $30. But then at the end of the year, it's like, hey, I just got $800 back or something. It's like, hey, I like these credit cards. So if you can afford to pay them off and you get rewards, they can be fantastic, right? So most people I know who are in a good place financially, and they like these. They like credit cards. They're very convenient, and they get a lot of rewards. But the reality is, if you're 20 years old and you have no money, they're going to get you in big trouble. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. Any questions on credit cards? Yeah.
So, how would you cancel a credit card if you
They have ways. You call them or you write to them and you cancel it, basically. Yeah, you cancel the card. Yeah. And, I love credit cards. But like I said, to me, they're a big benefit to me. When I was in college, they've been paying me back all the money I sent to them when I was a dumb college student, basically. Right? All those fees and all the money that poor college student me that needed them so I could pay for my law school applications and get my first month rent on one because I had no money and so forth, and then I paid crazy fees on. They've been paying me back at $600, $700, or $800 a year since then, right? So I'm probably ahead now, but the point is, a lot of people get in big trouble with credit cards. Yeah.
Does canceling a credit card lower your credit score?
Oh, good question. Okay, so hey, credit score is the very next topic. Okay, so credit score and your credit history basically Anytime you get a credit card or you take out a loan, like say, I don't mean like your buddy lends you $5. I mean, you take out a student loan, you buy a car where there's a bank loan, you take out a mortgage on your house, anything like that. Those things get reported to the credit bureaus. The idea is lenders need to know whether or not it makes sense to lend you money. Are you a good bet? When people lend you money, do you pay them back and you do it on time, right? If you don't, they want to know that because they don't want to lend you money. Or they might lend you money, but they're going to offer you horrible terms, right? Incredibly high interest rates and fees. So how good your credit is will dictate things like, will you qualify for a mortgage? And how good a mortgage will it be? Will you qualify for this or that, okay? Now, all this information gets sent to these credit bureaus, and they usually keep it's about 7 years for most things. Certain things stay on there longer. Bankruptcies, I think, stay on, typically 7 years as well. So if you file bankruptcy, that'll be on your credit report. If you ever have something that goes into collections, like where basically you quit paying it and they submit it to a collection service, where they sell your debt to someone because you just completely defaulted, that'll be on there. And they use very complex formulas that they, of course, don't disclose to the public that tells you how they calculate what's called the credit score. And so the idea is based on all of your history, good and bad. And this has to do also with things like how many different accounts do you have? How long have you held those accounts? What was your average balance on those accounts? Have you ever missed? How often have you missed? There's lots of things that factor into it. They calculate a score for you. And there's, exceptionally good scores, kind of okay scores, bad scores, and like horrible scores. And there's ranges of these things. And those are going to dictate what you get. Now, if you credit, they like seeing accounts that you've had for a very long time. That will typically help your credit. When a new account hits, like you take out a brand new one, a lot of times your credit score will drop a little bit immediately. But these are not giant changes. They're usually fairly small. Big things are going to happen if you have really bad history, you've been missing a lot of payments, you defaulted on something. Those are going to tank your score. Every different one of the reporting agencies, I think, use a slightly different scale. But 800 plus is crazy good. Does that make sense? That's really good. And you're not going to have that immediately. I think my wife and I, even though we had a lot of credit card debt, we were poor college students, we did pay everything on time, and we had student loans, we had all that stuff. When we first got out of college, our credit was, because we'd had a lot of credit, but we paid things, it wasn't bad. Our credit score was probably, in the 700s, which is good. But now it's well over 800, because we have now much more time and a lot more history of all having good stuff. You're not going to jump to that immediately. That takes years and years. Does that make sense? Okay? And you can mess it up really fast. You mess it up really fast. You start defaulting on stuff, you're going to be in the 500s or the 400. I mean, it's bad, right? Okay. All right, let's keep going. Bottom line is, it takes a long time to have really good credit, and it takes no time to have really bad credit. Yeah.
So does checking your credit score?
Does checking your credit score? No. Checking your credit score does not lower it. Generally speaking, it's a good idea, especially once you start feeling like there's a decent chance that you might actually have some credit out there. It's a good idea to once a year at least pull your credit reports, because sometimes false stuff gets submitted. You can have someone who commits fraud, for example. I had this happen to me once. I had a credit card that I had since I was in college, right? So like a lot of dumb college students, I accrued all this debt, and then finally, after my first or second summer, I can't remember, in law school, you go work a summer job, and they pay you really well for the summer job. And I basically paid it off entirely. It felt so good. I'm like, I'm now done with that. And what happens is, because it was all paid off, they don't send you monthly bills usually, right? Of course, now a lot of it's done online, but back then they usually mail them out to you. And if you owed something, then you got a monthly bill, like an invoice. If you didn't know anything, they just didn't mail anything, right? Well, I had just paid it, so I'm like, hey, they're going to mail anything. Well, they used to do this other thing where they would mail out, and they probably some of them still do, they would mail out to whatever your address is, basically checks, where you can spend it like a check, but it's like a cash advance. It hits your credit card, and there may also be fees for using it. Well, they mailed them to a temporary summer address that I had, right? And apparently someone got them out of the mail and committed fraud and spent them. And I didn't know what had happened because they were still sending my bills to the old address. In other words, something got crossed there with sort of where things were going. And I wasn't expecting to be getting a bill because I paid off my credit card, right? I didn't owe anything. So it took me a while to figure out what was happening. And then when I finally figured it out, then it took like months to report it and jump through all the hoops and have them do investigate. Eventually, it all got cleared out, but it takes a while. So it's generally a good idea to kind of watch those things because things like that do happen. I mean, there are mistakes made and there's also fraud and stuff that happens. And it can mess up your credit. Yeah.
Earlier you mentioned selling that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, if you owe me $1,000, right, then that's something I can sell to someone else. That's a marketable item. That's something I can say, okay, how much would you give me? He owes me $1,000. Here are the terms. He's supposed to pay it off over the next 5 years. And you'll say, I don't know, how's he doing? I say, well, he hasn't done so great, you know. But because of that, I kind of get rid of it. So if you give me like $80, I'll let you have that. And then it's your job to try to collect him that $1,000. So you go and harass him, and hopefully you get him to pay you the $1,000. And a lot of times it's more like, I'll take $6 for this $1,000 that I'm never going to touch. And so there are people out there that are like, hey, yeah, we'll buy all the debt, and then we'll bombard people and everyone they know with calls and harass them until maybe they, anyways, that's whole industries, cottage industries, right, of collections, where basically they'll try to hunt people down and threaten them and do things in all sorts of ways that probably should, in many cases, aren't even legal. There are rules about it, but they don't know if they cross the line anyway. But yeah, you can sell debt basically. So if you default on a loan, it's probably going to be sold into collections, and some collections agency is going to try to hunt you down and harass you until they get you to pay something, which may never happen, but they're playing a game. They bought the debt for pennies on the dollar. If they get nickels back, then hey, they made money. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. Any other questions before we move on? Okay. All right. Let's talk about taxes. Dun, dun, dun. Okay. So I found that lots of people have a gross misunderstanding about taxes work. You hear a lot of people complain about, my God, their tax rates are so, people pay so much taxes. The reality is most people actually don't pay much federal tax. I've got charts I'll show you. Let me explain how this works. If you never had to deal with taxes, you don't necessarily know how this works. So the way the U.S. tax system works is it's on what's called a progressive system. And it means that everyone pays essentially the same amount on the first X number of dollars. Okay? You pay a certain percentage of those dollars. For every additional dollar you make through some next bracket, everyone pays the same additional rate. So for example, this shows you for up to $9,525 of income for an individual, or $19,000, it's basically double for someone who's married. That changes when you get way in the high bracket. Typically, it's double in the normal ranges. You pay 10%. Now, you might look at this and be like, well, does this mean if your income's $35,000, you pay 12%? No, it means you pay 10% on the first $9,500, and then for the next $29,000, you pay 12%. See? So you're paying a different rate for a different dollar depending on where that falls in your income for the year. Okay, you pay the same amount on the first, say, roughly 10 grand. Everyone pays the same amount on the roughly next 30 grand, and then they pay the same amount. See how this works? Now, here's the thing. You look at this and you're like, well, I bet most people that are paying like 20%. The reality is actually they're not. Because this is based off your adjusted income. There's lots of things that adjust your income. For example, there's things called deductions. A deduction means they take whatever your actual income was and they knock stuff off. And there's lots of things you get to deduct. Everyone has things called standard deductions that you can take. So usually you can either have a standard deduction or an itemized. So standard means like, no matter what, at a minimum, you can just take X amount off if you choose. Usually another option is to do what's called itemized. That means I think there's all these various things in the tax code that says I can take deductions for, like interest on college debt. Although I don't know if they got rid of that one recently. They made a lot of changes in the last year. Some of the things they got rid of, but it used to be the case, and I don't know if it's still the case. I think it is that you could, if you have interest on college debt, that interest was deductible. If you paid money into like a 401k, things like that, then that money comes out pre-tax. So it's like reducing. You pay $10,000 to your 401k. That's like your income was $10,000 less. Childcare expenses. Say you got to pay daycare. You pay $10,000 a year for daycare. Up to a certain number, you get to take that off. So by the time you make all these deductions, what they view as your taxable income is not your original income. See how this works? Okay. Now, once you've gotten essentially how much they view as your taxable income, they then use these brackets to figure out how much you owe. That's the idea. Now, the tax system is relatively complicated, but the bottom line is most of the complications actually help you because they're all the different ways in which you pay less, right? So if it was a very simple system and it just said, hey, you pay blank amount, then, it would be straightforward. But typically, having the ability to deduct this or this or that actually results in you possibly paying less. All right, now, let me give you an idea here. This is federal income tax. This is information that might be a year or two old, but it's a pretty good estimate. What you'll notice is people who have income of less than $10,000 effectively pay negative tax. You say, how do you pay negative tax? Well, because a lot of times there's things like credits that you get, which basically says that you don't deduct your income, you literally get X amount reduced from what you have to pay, and if that makes the amount you pay negative, we give you money back. It's a way of basically, it's basically a way to redistribute wealth to some extent. So people who are really poor, who might basically have kids and have a hard time, feeding them, our system basically says, hey, we're going to give you certain credits because you have a kid and so forth, and you have no income. So anyway, the bottom line is, if your income is really low, you're probably actually paying negative federal tax. Now, I'm not saying negative tax until there's sales tax. I'm talking about income tax. Okay, you don't actually get to paying someone average until you get to about $40,000 to $50,000 of income, right? And even up to until you get to about $200,000 of income for an individual, you're typically under 15%. So that's why it's very misleading. Just look at those brackets. Does that make sense? It's very misleading. I can tell you when my wife and I were both working as attorneys and our income got quite substantial, we oftentimes still paid less than 15 or 20% taxes because we were doing things like maxing out our 401ks, right? That meant if there was 16 or 17,000 per person you could invest per year, that came right off as if we didn't earn it. We had interest on our college debt, and if that was $5,000 a year or something, that came off as if we weren't paying it. Interest on your mortgage oftentimes was also deductible. Also, if you made payments on property taxes, like if you own a house, you're going to pay property taxes. That all comes off. And so by the time you start marking all this stuff off, right, then your income doesn't look nearly so high anymore. And then when you calculate your taxes as a percentage of really what you made at the beginning, it's not a very big percentage anymore necessarily. Nevertheless, in general, as your income goes up, the percentage will go up. You notice people who made $1 million and over paid about 27% on average. Okay, so it's definitely progressive. It goes up quite a bit, but it's not very much until you get that be in the higher income ones. Now, that's income tax. That's not all you pay. There's something else called payroll taxes. And so payroll taxes are Social Security, Medicare, those sorts of things. So when you get a job, you'll see this cut out of your paycheck, right? You'll see there are certain payroll taxes. They might call it FICA or what have you. The point is, these are things that basically you pay regardless of your income. Everyone pays this. It gets cut off immediately. It's your contribution towards the Social Security system, towards Medicare, things like that. See, these are essentially safety nets that are built into our society. And the idea is that once you reach a certain age, usually it's like 65 or 62 or 67. It depends on the program and depends on how old you are right now. The idea is you pay in a certain percentage of your income, like your whole life, right? And then once you reach a certain age, you're entitled to get a certain, it's sort of like how a pension would work, except there's no money being saved. It's not a very sustainable system the way it's designed, because the way they pay out, say, Social Security right now is with current tax dollars. And so years ago when it first started, the number of people that were drawing on it was fairly small, and you had a lot of people who were paying in. Now you have a lot of people drawing on it, and not as many people paying in. But a lot of people have no other savings. Like politically, it's a tough situation because you're not going to tell everyone that's 70 years old and has nothing, they got to suddenly live on the street. On the other hand, probably the system eventually is going to fail. Like it's not really sustainable the way it's set up. But the point is, right now, you pay into this if you have a job. Most people pay about 8% into this. Okay, so about 8% comes off, and that's regardless of the other taxes. Okay, now there is actually caps for Social Security. You only pay, it's like the Social Security part's like 5.5%, but it's capped at a certain income. You pay like 5.5% on the first 120,000 income. After that, you pay nothing on that. Okay, and what you get back is capped. It's based on how much you earn. So how much you paid in dictates to some extent how much you get back later on. Not everyone gets the same amount. So people who paid more in will get more back as a benefit. Now, if you combine all of this together, that's what this is showing. So the total federal tax you pay, income tax plus these payroll taxes, now is reflected here. And you'll notice people who have very low income will actually pay a more substantial fraction. Now, it's because of the other things. There may be other things that aren't counted here too. I pulled this from somewhere. It's the same site, the two things. But what you'll notice is they generally do trend up. It's hard to get too much lower. I'm kind of wondering about this one because it doesn't fit with the other number. But again, there's probably some nuance I didn't read about. Most of these make a lot of sense. Like it's roughly the 8.5 plus the other number. But there's probably some little thing I forgot to read here. They probably have like an asterisk to explain this one anomaly. But generally speaking, they're going to trend up. So this means if you make over $1 million, people paid about a third between payroll taxes and income tax. That's the idea. The overall average for all people was about 21%. Does that make sense? That covered both of those things. And part of that is paying into a system that, in theory, someday if it doesn't collapse, you'll get money back out of. So it's not all just regular tax. Does that make sense? In theory, you're going to get a chunk of this back someday, if it doesn't collapse first. All right, on we go. Now, all right. Yeah, we're not quite. We got a little more time. All right, major issue here: buying a house. Okay, let's talk about this. So, most people have this dream of owning a house. If you live in certain places like San Francisco, it's a dream. It's probably not going to happen. Manhattan, San Francisco, good luck. But, if you live in Dallas or somewhere else, then it is more possible, though it's still not a given. I mean, things get more expensive, but it's more reasonable. In San Francisco, if you lived in a nice area of San Francisco, you might have your condo that you own that's 1,400 square feet that costs you $1.5 million or something. Like, it's crazy. It's ridiculously expensive. Okay. All right, but let's say that you want to buy a house. The mortgage is what they call the loan on the house. You're talking about a mortgage. It's just a loan to buy real estate, basically. That's what a mortgage is. Now, when you take out a mortgage, it's secured by the property, which means that you go to the bank and the bank lends you money to buy the house. Okay, until you pay off that loan, you don't really own the house, right? It's still owned by the bank because after all, they gave you the money to pay for it. So what that means is if you default on your loan, meaning you don't make your payments, they can do what's called foreclosure, where basically they step in and they say, you've defaulted, you're not meeting your part of the obligations, we now take the property back. Does that make sense? We'll get into more of the details, but that's the idea. So when I say it's secured by the property, that's what I mean. The property is like collateral. Does that make sense? So if you don't pay, they get the property back, is the way this typically works. Now, a typical repayment period is 30 years, but there's all different types of loans. Most people just have 30-year mortgages. You can even get a 30-year mortgage if you're like 50, even though you're probably not going to work till you're 80. That's just a standard repayment. The truth is, most people sell their home after 5 or 10 years anyway. And so at that point, and when you sell your house to someone else, you take the proceeds that you get and you use it to pay off whatever you owe, and whatever's left over was the equity you had left over. So typically, people are not going to pay it off over 30 years. They'll sign up to do it over 30, but they're not going to really stay in the house for that long. Okay, although there are advantages to that. Most people just don't from a practical standpoint for lots of reasons. Now, the mortgage payment is how much you have to pay on the loan. So this is basically the payment on the loan itself. This covers both paying for the actual principal amount that you borrowed, but also interest. Okay. Now, in terms of interest rate, usually it depends on whatever the market conditions are. So you're like, what does that mean? Okay. Well, the Fed out there basically lends money to banks, and they set different rates. And depending on the rates of those, it affects other rates. And the bottom line is all this stuff sort of moves. It all moves. And so in recent years, mortgage interest rates have been quite low. You see a lot of like the 3 to 5% range over the last 5 or 10 years. That's really low. Historically, I think an average rate is probably more like 6%. There have been times when they've been over 10%. Okay, so historically, the rates have done a lot of fluctuation. For the last 15 or 20 years, they've typically been fairly low. I would say the last 15 years, they probably, maybe 15 years ago, they might have been about 5.5%, 6%, and then they kind of dipped down even lower. But they've been fairly low historically. Part of that is tied to the fact that inflation's fairly low too. There's a lot of things that factor into this. Typically, anyway, we don't need to go too deep. Okay, now, foreclosure. This is what I mentioned a second ago. Your property is the security for the loan. So if you don't pay, they can foreclose. Now, it's not just the person that gives you the loan for the mortgage. There's other people that can foreclose too. Like a lot of times, if you buy a house and you buy it in some sort of an addition, there'll be a homeowners association. Like around here, mostly there's homeowners association. And so when you buy your house, you're agreeing because you're going to be part of such and such division that you'll pay, say, $500 a year to the homeowners association, and they'll use that to basically, plant things. If you have a community pool, to do whatever, keep things that aren't on your property but that are part of the community property up. And also they'll have certain people whose job it is to sort of go around and see, hey, is this person mowing their lawn? Is that person not staying in their fence? Because what they're trying to do is maintain the quality and maintenance of all the properties, because the reality is if everyone who lives around you doesn't maintain the property, your property will be worth very much. And so the idea behind a homeowner association is everyone has to sort of agree that they're going to do certain things. And what happens is if you don't do those things, and the homeowner association says you need to repair this and you don't, they can also foreclose on your property. They can take your property from you. So people who are like, it's homeowner association, I'm going to ignore them. You can get your house foreclosed on for that. So anyway, on we go. All right, so how do you qualify for a mortgage? The answer is, first of all, you want good credit, right? If you want a bank to loan you hundreds of thousands of dollars, then you're going to want some good credit. Now, you do have the property itself, right, as collateral. So that gives them some security. They know if they have to go in and take the property, at least they get that. But, banks don't want to take properties. Believe it or not, they're in the business of making loans. They're not in the business of owning properties. Does that make sense? They really don't want to foreclose. They do that when they have to for business reasons. They would much rather that people just paid off their stuff, right? That's what they're in the business for, is making loans and so forth and doing other related financial things, okay? Now, how much income does it take? The banks are going to basically calculate all of the things that you owe. So when you say you want a mortgage, you have to show them how much your income is, how much assets you have, all of your various debts that you, student loans, credit cards, whatever. And they usually use some formulas, and they make certain assumptions. Like they'll say, in order to get sort of a standard loan, what's called a conforming loan that sort of meets the standard rules, you can't have more than X percentage of whatever you make be payments on liability. So they'll add up. You owe $100 a month for this, $200 a month, $300. Okay, that leaves you this amount here, or else you exceed that percentage. And so they'll tell you can borrow up to X amount. Does this make sense? Okay. Now, a down payment is the money that you essentially pay down up front. So they're typically not going to just say, hey, you want to buy a house, here's 100% of the value. I say that. Actually, that can be done. But a standard mortgage is usually 80%. They usually say you need 20% down. So you say, well, 20% is kind of a lot, right? So let's say it's a $300,000 house. Right here, I use the example of a $250,000 house. So 20% is $50,000. Like, I got to wait till I have $50,000 to buy the house? And the answer is no. Most people do not actually wait till then. What they do is they take out a second loan, a second mortgage that covers the 20% or 15% or some fraction of it. Typically, the second one is at a higher rate. Does that make sense? It's at a higher rate. And part of the reason it's at a higher rate is because the primary lender, the 80%, if you default, and I mentioned if it's default, someone go get your house, right? You end up with a battle where the two lenders are like, they didn't pay us or you. And there's a priority in this process. And the primary lender has the priority. So they're going to, because they're the ones that gets first dibs on getting paid back, it means they might accept a little lower interest rate because their risk's a little bit lower. So your secondary lenders are going to typically have higher interest rates. So those second loans are usually higher percentage. Yeah. Well, let's talk about it. Okay. So here's the deal. If you can't pay 20% down, then a lot of banks will say, we'll lend you the money, but now you have to take out something called PMI. PMI is basically insurance. What you're doing is paying an insurance premium to a company on behalf of the bank. And if you default, that insurance company will pay the other 20% to the bank. Right? That's the idea. Since you didn't have the 20%, you're going to pay some interest. Now that gets expensive. That's several $100s a month oftentimes. And you do not, and in some it's hard to get rid of. You don't want to have PMI. So a lot of times to avoid the PMI, you need 20% down. You don't have 20% down, you take out another loan. So for a lot of people, that's actually a better option than PMI. PMI is usually something to be avoided. So most of the time, one way or the other, you're paying 20%. Whether it's out of your pocket or it's another loan or something, usually that's going to happen. Now there's loans that are called non-conforming, like someone's got some weird circumstances. And there are companies that will make non-conforming loans, but usually the rates are worse. The terms are usually worse. So there's kind of standard terms that if you can meet these things, you get standard loans, and those are usually better. That's what you want to do typically, is get a conforming loan. But you get the bottom line here. You take out a mortgage, you pay some money down, and you may borrow some of that, and then you're going to have to pay it back with interest. Usually the interest rates on mortgages aren't that high, right? So I showed you earlier, oftentimes for student loans, it's maybe 6%, 7%, right? For credit cards, it might be 10, 15% depending on the card, right? And you could get a really good one that's less, but it could be higher. Mortgages have been in that 3 to 5% range. And keep in mind that, and I'm not sure if they changed this recently because they just did a tax overhaul and they changed this stuff. It used to be the case, and it might still be, that interest paid on a mortgage was also deductible. In other words, let's say you got a $250,000 mortgage. Okay? You got a 4% interest. So for the year, you just accrued $10,000 in interest. The reality is you probably paid like $15,000 on your loan payments for the year, and most of it went to pay off interest. In the early years, it's mostly paying off interest. What happens is that $10,000 got deducted from your income before you paid your federal taxes. So if your marginal rate, that's like the rate on your last dollars earned was 25%, you effectively got 25% of $10,000 cut off of taxes. You just saved $2,500. So if you had a pretty low interest rate on your mortgage, like why in the world would you pay that off fast? Right? If your interest rate on your mortgage is 3 to 4%, and then you're getting to deduct that, you're like, rather than spend more money on my mortgage, I'll go invest that somewhere where I can get 5 or 10% rate of return. Does that make sense? So it doesn't always make sense to pay off your debts faster. Sometimes it's better to take that money that you would be using to pay these things off that are low interest and invest it somewhere else. But those are all choices people make. There's some risk obviously involved with that, right? Okay, closing costs. Every time you buy or sell a house, you're going to pay these fees. And they're usually several $1,000s in addition to things like realtor's fees. That factors into it. There's usually some other costs as well, just like loan generation fees. The bottom line here is if you go buy or sell a house, you're probably, and especially if you're buying, you're paying usually loan origination fees. There's fees on the loans. If you sell, you're usually the person that has to pay the realtor's fee, but it's all worked into the price of the house. Does that make sense? So one or the other, you're kind of paying for it. The reality is you're looking at thousands, usually tens of thousands of dollars that somehow gets pulled out of the value of the property. Pay realtors or pay for other things. So if you're buying a house and selling it every 3 years, that's really dumb. That's really dumb. Now, sometimes you can't help it, right? You bought a house, 3 years later, you were married, you get divorced, or you got relocated, you got to move to another city. Like sometimes it has to happen. The people that just buy a new house every 6 years, they're just spending money like crazy on all these fees. It's just coming right out of the property. So generally speaking, that's a bad idea. Yeah, you usually want to be able to own your property for a while. I would say it usually takes, maybe probably 3 or 4 years just to get to the point where you've recovered the fees back. Does that make sense? Before you're even sort of back to break even. Does that make sense? And really, if you can hold it for if you can hold your house for 15 years, that's great, right? The longer you hold it, the more equity you're going to build and the less often you're incurring these fees that you're going to incur every time you buy or sell. The other thing that happens is, as I mentioned a second ago, usually whenever you pay, if you can look at a mortgage repayment plan, you might pay $1,500 a month, let's say, towards the mortgage. But some of that is towards interest, some of that is towards the principal, right? Actually paying down the loan. In the early years, it's majority interest. Mostly it's interest, right? Once you've paid most of the loan off, it's mostly going to adding to the equity, paying off the loan. Think about it this way. Say you owe $250,000. 4% of that is $10,000. That's $10,000 interest this year. When you only owe $100,000 on it now, because you paid it down to that point, it's $4,000 interest. So that's $6,000 less that went to interest and $6,000 more that went towards paying off the debt. That's $6,000 more in equity used to accrue. See? So you get more equity built up in the later years. So if you just hold it for a few years, you're not really accruing much equity anyway, unless it appreciates in value, just because homes in the neighborhood went up or something. You're not accruing much equity, and you're paying a lot of fees. So it's really dumb. All right, now, what a lot of people don't understand is that the cost to have a house is actually way more than the mortgage payment. So you calculate the mortgage payment, you're like, I can afford this house, but you're not actually accounting for everything. So I use an example of a $250,000 house. Obviously, home prices have been skyrocketing around here. This would probably be a below average priced home now in Allen. It probably was an average priced home 5 years ago, 3 years ago, but home prices have been skyrocketing. So let's say you have a $250,000 house. Okay. Let's say you manage the $50,000 payment, a down payment. So you have a $200,000 mortgage. Okay. Most people, by the way, do not have the 20%. But let's say you did. Even a lot of people who do choose not to pay it, especially if rates are low. They'd rather just borrow at a very low rate and put their money somewhere else. Well, let's say you do this, okay? Here's how it works out. The 30-year loan at 4% interest, the mortgage payment is $955 a month for 30 years, basically. Now, property taxes might be like $500. This depends on exactly where you live. I'm going to give you a ballpark figure. Okay, Texas has really high property taxes because you pay no state income tax. Okay, Earlier, I talked about federal income tax. A lot of states charge you a state income tax. And it might be 5 or 6 or 7%, right? Here, you don't pay that 5, 6, 7%. What you do is you pay property taxes that are really high. Now, a lot of other states, you still pay property taxes, but they're way lower. The same house might have $150 property tax per month. And here you pay a lot more, but you're not paying the income tax. One way or the other, they usually get their money. You have insurance on your property, right? You got to insure your property, but if you have a fire or something, right? It's required. This is not even optional. The lender is not going to lend you a bunch of money on a property that's their collateral without having insurance on it. This is not a, oh, do I want to insure it? It's required, okay? You have maintenance costs. So these are realistic prices on a $250,000 home. You notice the $955 mortgage payment now just became $1,700, $1,800 a month. So by the time you account for all these things, you're roughly doubling. And I'm not even accounting for really high maintenance. This is like regular maintenance. This isn't, I decide I want to renovate the bathroom, or even worse, we get some cracks in our foundation and we have to have someone come out and, install piers, or that could be many thousands. I'm not talking about that kind of stuff. I mean like regular maintenance, okay? All right, now here's the good news. $955 or what have you seems, you may say, man, I can barely make it now. The good news is that if you hold that property, 20 years from now, that's still the same payment. But 20 years from now, $1 is not worth the same as $1 is now. Everything inflates, right? That $955 might only be like $600 in today's dollars 20 years from now. So the longer you hold this, the less it is sort of in real value to you. Does that make sense? Okay? A set dollar amount is not nearly as costly to you in real value down the road when dollars are not worth as much, right? Because of inflation. You never really get to enjoy that, though, if you just sell the house, right, and turn around and buy another one. Some of these things, though, like property taxes, these things may just scale up with value of property. So these might just go up with inflation to some extent. The mortgage payment's not going to. Okay. This is probably a pretty good place to stop. You guys have any questions? Taken in the process of buying a car, and trust me, that can be a tough one. And then, more importantly, how in the world do you save? What are you saving for, and how do you do it, and how much are you going to need to save? Because I'll be honest, most people have no clue what the answer to any of those questions are. They don't even know where to begin figuring that out. I fortunately do have a clue, and I'm going to help you today. Okay, so let's start with buying a car. All right, so you decide, hey, I'm going to go buy a car. And the question is, how do you go about doing this without completely getting robbed, basically? All right, so a couple of things you need to know right off the bat is that when you go to look for cars, a lot of time I'm addressing will be for new cars, but a lot of the same things going with used cars. With used cars, there's actually a lot more flexibility in the purchase price. There's a lot more. Because a lot of times if there's a used car, they've a car lot or something has gotten it as a trade-in, and they've probably paid way less than it was worth to someone else. And so they got a lot of wiggle room. They don't really want to keep it on their lot. They just want to make a little money. And so you can really get a good deal sometimes with used cars. Of course, if you buy a used car from a lot, you're going to typically pay a lot more than if you buy it from a person. Does that make sense? Okay. Typically, if you trade in a car, you're going to get bottom dollar for it in the trade-in. And then if you buy from a lot, you're going to pay top dollar. Does that make sense? But there's some levels, some ability to negotiate. You typically are going to be able to get a car cheaper that's used if you get it from someone that actually has the car directly. Typically, that's what happens. Okay, not always, but oftentimes you get a better price going directly to a person for used cars. Okay. Regardless, though, if you trade in a car, you're probably not going to get a lot for it. There are places you can go, like Kelley Blue Book and so forth, and it'll show values, trade-in values, and it will show you trade-in values and then market values. Like, in other words, if it's person-to-person market value, and you'll notice that the value it gives you for your vehicle will be considerably different if you're selling it from person to person versus going through a dealership. Does that make sense? You're not going to get as much as a trade-in. What you get is convenience. A lot of people are looking to get another car, say they're going to go buy a new car or what have you, and they want to get rid of their old car. They don't want to have to deal with trying to sell their car to someone else. So what you get is a little bit of convenience in that process. Hey, I'll get it all done now. I don't have to worry about selling to somebody else. So you just take less for it. But do understand you probably will take less if you do that. That's what's going to happen. You can sell your car for more if you're willing to jump through all the hoops of selling it directly to other people. Now, right now I'm concerned more about the actual purchase piece of this. So let's say you're going to go in and you're going to purchase a car. So let's talk about new cars. Like I said, some of this would apply to used as well, but there's a lot more ability to argue about the price and so forth. Okay, so typically if you're buying a new car, there's two numbers that are really important that you're going to see. One's called the MSRP, which is the manufacturer suggested retail price. This is usually right on the window of your car. And then there's the thing that's called the manufacturer's invoice price. And let me explain the difference between these two things. The invoice price, in theory, is how much the car actually cost the dealership. In other words, the dealership has to get the car from, say they're a Toyota dealership. They got to buy the car from Toyota, right? You have to ship the car to your location to sell it. You maybe put a couple of add-ons on and you have to pay to do that, like tint the windows. And in theory, this is like the amount it costs them. So theoretically, if they sell you the car for this price, they don't make $1. Now, that's not actually quite right. The reality is that typically there's a little bit of profit already built into the invoice price. There are a few things in there where they're going to probably still make a little money, even at this price. Now, the MSRP is the so-called manufacturer suggested retail price. This is like maybe not a randomly selected, but a not particularly good representation of the value of the car. The manufacturer says, Toyota says, we've got our new Honda Accord, or Toyota, I guess wouldn't be Honda. So Honda would say, we have our new Honda Accord, and for this particular model, we suggest that you sell it for $28,000. Okay, now a lot of times the difference of these two things is several $1,000s. And typically the more expensive the car, the bigger the difference. Some manufacturers have bigger differences than others. Some manufacturers, a lot of times there's like a $2,000 difference. Some maybe $4,000 or $5,000 or $6,000 difference. Here's the thing. You should never, ever pay this ever, or you're a moron. Never pay that. Ever, ever, ever. Okay? Now, will I tell you there are people who do not pay that? No, there are people who pay this. There are people who just walk in and are like, well, that's the price. I don't pay that. Now, I will say there are a few exceptions to this rule. If what you want is a car that they've made 4 of, right? In other words, there aren't many out there, and there's a bazillion people that want to buy it. The price of a car, its value is based on what people are willing to pay for it. And if there aren't many of them, and everybody wants it, then in theory, the price could even be higher than this. Does that make sense? Like, that could happen. But that's not typically the case. You're going to go buy a car, that's not the case. That's a very special case. In general, don't ever, 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 ever even think about paying this. Okay? Now, let's say that the difference in these is, $3,000. That's probably a fairly average difference. You should be looking for a price that's probably about $500 above this. In other words, really close to this. You might even get it for this. Sometimes you'll get the car for less than invoice. Because a lot of times, the dealership will have certain incentives in place. Like, say, again, it's a Honda dealership. Honda may say, hey, this month, we're going to encourage more sales by giving rebates and so forth. So that's not money that's coming out of the pocket of the dealership. Honda's getting some money off. So if they sell for this price and there's $1,000 rebate, they actually made $1,000. See? Now, a lot of those are very well known. They'll be advertising $1,000 rebates, and you're like, great, that means I need to work $1,000 off of everything else I'd be willing to pay in general. That makes sense? Just adjust everything based on things like that. But if you didn't have anything like that, then you want to do like invoice plus a little bit. And that's probably a price that someone will take. Maybe not the first dealer you go to, but if you go to 2 or 3 dealers, someone will probably sell you that car for invoice plus $400 or $300 or $500 or something. Does that make sense? So if it's priced up $3,000 over, don't even think about paying the MSRP. If you're paying more than halfway between, you're probably almost certainly overpaying. Does that make sense? You're paying more than you need to. You can get them to sell it for much less than that. Now, the other thing you understand about buying a car is you do not want to seem overeager. When you go in to buy a car, you do not know exactly what car you want. You've been doing some research, and you've got it nailed down to like 3 or 4 different possibilities, not all of which they sell. Right? I'm looking at the Honda Accord, but I'm also looking at the Toyota Camry and the Nissan, and here are at least 4 other cars that I'm not going to buy today. I'm absolutely walking in with no intention, and there's no way in the world I'm going to buy today. Right? I'm just coming in to take a look at the cars and get a little information. You're never, ever walking as I'm here to buy a Toyota Camry. They're like, thank you, that sounds fantastic. Here's the price. But actually, it's higher because there's so much demand. But all salespeople are just a hair more. They're like, okay, here's all my money. No. And you walk in and you're looking at a variety of cars, not all of which they have, and you're not going to buy. We tell them right up front, I'm not buying one today. And they'll probably ask you, what would it take for you? Well, that wouldn't happen. I guess if you gave me a ludicrous price, maybe. I've actually had that happen. The first time I bought a new car, I was right out of law school, and I remember I was looking at like 3 different cars, and I'd gone around different places, and again, I'd gone everywhere, I don't know what I want, and I went to go finally look at, I think it was a Mazda lot, and it was like my least favorite of the 3. And so it was very clear when I walked in that I wasn't all that interested in what they were selling, right? And I'm like, yeah, whatever, I'm not all that interested, and like, well, what would it take? And I actually gave them a price that was well below this value. And they were like, that's laughable. And I said, okay, that's okay. I'd already sort of worked out a deal with someplace else where they said, hey, for this price, we think we could sell it to you. And it was a really good price. So I said, okay, let me go to this other place. I'm still not going to buy yet. I need to go somewhere else. So I went to Mazda, and I went in, pretty sure I was going to buy this other car. And I told them, now here's the deal. They already told me they'd sell me this car, and I like that car better. And it's already at X, so you have to give me some ridiculous price. And I gave them a price that was actually a couple $1,000s below the invoice price. And they literally laughed at me. They're like, that's ridiculous. We'd never sell that. I said, okay, I understand. Goodbye. Before I could leave the lot, they ran me down. Come back inside. Come back. Eventually, they sold it to me for that price. Okay? The more willing you are to walk away, and the more clear you make it that you're not really that. This car's maybe okay. I'm not necessarily a car person. I'm not buying a car because to me, a car is something that's useful, and it all depends on the price of the car. It's not I'm sold on getting this car. It's I can take this car, this car, this car. And the one you have I kind of like, but I kind of like this one maybe a little bit better. But if this was a good enough price, you're going to get a better deal. See how this works? Okay, that's the way this works. Now, they probably had a lot of other incentives that month that I wasn't even aware of that allowed them to do that, right? But the point here is, ordinarily they're not going to sell your price for a couple $1,000s below the invoice. But if they got special things that you don't know about going on, they might be able to make that happen. Like it might be that Mazda had told them if you hit a certain number of sales for that month, you get some big kickback. And maybe it was the end of the month and they were a couple of sales short or something. I don't know about that. But they do that stuff with the dealerships. See how this works? Okay. All right. So the bottom line is don't walk in knowing the car you're going to buy. You may know, but don't let them know. Right? Don't go to just a dealership. You go to several. Never, ever pay this. You should pay close to this, maybe a little above. If you can do less, great. But usually you're probably going to pay a little bit above invoice. So they're going to want to make a little bit of money. An invoice might give them a little money, but not a lot. One thing you should know is if you buy extra packages, like I'm going to get the luxury package, right? Usually the upcharge on that, in other words, the difference in the invoice and the markup, is enormous in all of those things. So for a base model car, the markup might be like $2,000. If you buy something that has the sunroof and the moonroof and the entertainment, they might add $5,000 to the price, but the invoice and all that might be $3,000. They just added $2,000 more of markup. What this means is the more sort of extras you have built in, probably the bigger difference you're going to see in these two things, and the more you can get them to come down. Does that make sense? Which is not to say you necessarily go buy something that has all those things. If you don't want those things, don't buy it. It's just to say they have huge markups in all the things they add on. That's just the way this works. There's enormous markups on all of those things. That's how this works. You should also note that the dealers aren't dumb, right? This is their business. They automatically slap things on cars that add a markup. You pretty much can't go to a dealership, for example, where they'll have something called, what do they call them? Like the dealer, it's like the dealer add-ons. And like pretty much every car on the lot, we've added a pinstripe and floor mats and like these generic little things. And all that adds up to $600, for which it cost them $150. What they're saying is they're going to make $450 that's built in right there. See, that's why you don't have to worry so much about paying a lot more. They're going to make some money somewhere, probably. But typically, if you can get a little bit above this, you're probably paying a reasonably good price. I'll also tell you that it's very easy to get pricing information. You can actually Google online how much are people actually paying, and there are places where they've gathered information. They'll tell you, 90% of people pay more than this. Half the people pay, and you can kind of get an idea for how much it's going to cost for that car. You want to know that before you walk in. Because you don't want to walk in and pay more than everybody else, right? See how this works? Okay, now, the first thing you do is you negotiate the price. Then you negotiate separately the financing. This is where people get taken, okay? What happens when you go in to buy a car is they say, well, how much can you afford to pay per month? All they're going to do is manipulate the financing terms. They can decrease the monthly payment by having you pay off that loan over 8 years instead of 5 years. Or by, you see what happens? You're going to get the best overall deal if you have the best price and the best financing. And they're completely separate things. You do them separately. We're not going to talk about financing until I get the best price. Then after I get the best price, I'm going to get the best financing available. Now, ordinarily when you go in to buy a car like this, they'll have their finance person take your information, run your credit or what have you, and figure out what financing they can give you. Sometimes there's really good financing offers. Like to encourage sales, Honda will offer 2% financing for 4 years or something. If you get a really good deal like that, then you might want that. You have to usually have good enough credit and so forth. You have to qualify. Here's my tip to you when it comes to the financing piece. You don't walk in to buy a car without already having a reasonable financing offer. Before you walk in, you can go to a bank or some places that does car loans, and you can already get pre-approved, and they'll already look at your stuff and say, we will give you a loan at X rate for up to X amount. If you walk in and you say, I'm already approved for up to $30,000 or $40,000 at 4%, guess what? You usually get a better deal than that when their finance person tries to work out the best financing they can offer you. They usually beat that deal. If you don't walk in with that deal, they may only give you an offer that's 5% or something. You follow me? You walk in, you already have a good finance option available. They usually give you an even better one. If you don't have that, you usually get a worse one. Now, what you can do if you don't think ahead and you don't get that worked out is after you buy the car, you can always go and refinance. That means basically you take out a loan from somebody else to pay off the loan that you owe, but with better terms. So I bought the car with 6% interest, but then I go to my local bank and they tell me to give me a loan of 3.5%. And so I take the loan from them and it pays off this one. And now I just owe it 3.5%. So that's called refinancing. The only downside of that is, other than the fact you have to jump through another hoop, is that there may be a little bit of a small fee that they're going to encounter to give you the loan. They'll charge you $50 or something to originate the loan. Does that make sense? There's a small fee. But in the long term, you're saving money. All right, so bottom line is, you want to negotiate price separately from financing. It's best if you already have a good financing deal before you walk in. Your credit is going to absolutely make a difference on what financing deals you get. And never, ever, ever pay anything close to this, right? Okay, we doing good? Well, I'll also tell you that after you've already worked out the car price, they're going to try to take you for a bunch of additional money, right? So you've worked out the price and you've worked out the financing. You're like, I've got this all figured out. And they're like, great. Now let's talk about all these other things we offer. We have this special extended warranty, and we have this service plan where you can prepay for your oil changes. And they'll have all of these things you can buy, all of which contain additional markups. That's other places they get profit. Now, some of those things are good to have, right? And a lot of that depends on your circumstances. Depending on your circumstances, you might want a longer warranty or you might not. If you buy a car and the standard warranty is 60,000 miles and you're going to sell your car in 2 years and only have 40,000 miles, then who cares? Does that make sense? If you're going to buy your car and hold it for 10 years, then maybe you want that extended warranty. On the other hand, it also depends on how much it costs, right? How much are you charging for that warranty? Like, what value am I getting out of it? And those are things that are actually negotiable to some extent too. But the point here is, just watch out for all the extras. If you'll say, I got my price, and then by the time they add all those, it's like another $4,000. Let me give you a great example of a markup that pretty much every human being pays, except for me. Okay? Now, I would pay it if my circumstances were different. Okay? There's something called gap insurance. You guys ever heard of gap insurance? Here's the idea. You buy a new car, you drive it off the lot, it instantaneously depreciates by like $3,000. Right? You paid $26,000. You actually paid more because you paid additional amount for the extra warranty and everything. And then you walk off the lot and they're like, oh great, you drove it back. Would you like to sell it to us again? We'll give you $23,000 for that car. Okay. The value just dropped. What happens if you drive down the road and you get into an accident? Your insurance company will ordinarily pay you the value, which is now $22,000, but you owe $26,000 or $27,000 or $28,000. There's a gap. Hence the name gap insurance. So gap insurance insures the gap. It's so that if you get into an accident, your car gets totaled, the amount that you get back from your insurance covers the full cost of your loan. See how this works? Now, this sounds really wonderful, but it's like everything else. There is a value associated with that. It's based on how likely you are to get into an accident and how big the gap is. And then there's a price associated with that, right? If you're incurring a risk of being $5,000 short and you think there's a pretty good chance you're going to encounter it and they'll give you the gap insurance for $1 a month, hey, I'll take that. But insurance is another place where they make money. And a lot of times, right, they're not going to sell you insurance unless they know average over all people, they're going to bring in more money than they're spending. See how this works? So, if you get to a point in your life where you're really well off financially, and you're very secure, and you're like, you know what, if by some chance I get into an accident and I'm $4,000 short, I'll just, whatever. Bad luck, I'll be $4,000 short. Because I'm going to buy 6 other cars in my life, and on those I'm going to save the $1,500 on the gap insurance that I'm never going to need. And in that, I'm going to be better off. Then you don't need the gap insurance. See? You need the gap insurance if you get in that accident, you're really screwed because you're short. If you don't need that, then why would you pay for it? Obviously, the value of the insurance is less than the value of what you get from it, or they wouldn't sell it. See how this works? You follow me? Okay? So I don't buy gap insurance anymore because I'm in a good enough spot financially where I'm okay encountering the risk of. By the way, there's other options. Like for my wife and I, we've got insurance through USA and various other things because her father was in the Navy. And they offer an insurance that's called like the real, it's like an insurance that covers the real replacement value. And it doesn't quite cover it's the same idea. It doesn't quite cover everything the gap insurance covers, but it covers like most of it. So if the gap's $5,000, it might cover like $4,000 of it. And it's dirt cheap. It's ridiculously cheap. Like, why would I go pay your really expensive gap insurance when I can get almost the same coverage for like almost nothing? Right? It just doesn't make any sense. But most people will just say, oh, that makes sense. There's a gap. I should buy that. And they'll just spend the extra whatever $100, many hundreds of dollars over, or they'll tell you a monthly amount. Oh, it only adds, $24 a month for the next 5 years. And you're like, well, I just spent like $1,000 on that gap insurance. And to keep in mind, that gap is only usually there for a little while. After 2 years, you've paid enough in that maybe the value of the car is as much now, or you have enough equity built. In other words, you paid down the loan amount. Eventually, you hit the point where the amount that you owe is now less than the value of the car. It's only for the first window of time, that first year especially, maybe 18 months, that's not the case where there's a gap you even worry about. So anyway, I'm not saying don't buy gap insurance. For a lot of people, it makes a lot of sense. I'm just saying you got to actually understand how these things work so they don't just make a whole lot more money off you for no reason. Does this make sense? Okay, now, on we go. By the way, one time I actually had someone who was handling the car sale who basically argued with me about how dumb I was for not taking gap insurance. And I was like, no, I'm not. I've actually calculated it, and this is a stupid insurance for me to buy. They're like, but everyone buys gap insurance. I'm like, yeah, and a lot of people are morons. I don't want your gap insurance. I don't need your gap insurance. So anyway, amen. But everyone buys it. Yeah, so what? I don't need to do that. I have this other thing that covers almost all of it that's dirt cheap. I'm not going to pay for your gap insurance. But for a lot of people, I said it does make a lot of sense. Okay, let's move to retirement and investing. That's one of the big messages throughout this whole process is if you know a little bit, you're a lot more likely to make good choices, right? You just know a little bit about how things work, you'll make better choices. Yeah. Well, through USAA, we use them because, like I said, my wife's father was in the Navy, so she gets to be on it too. And then because I married her, we get to have USAA. One of the things they offer is a special kind of insurance. And I forget what it's called. I forget the name. But it basically covers the difference in the value of your car if you have an accident and and like what you paid originally, but it doesn't include a few of the extras. Like gap insurance might include like maybe taxes or like there's a few add-ons that it won't cover, but it covers then the majority of the gap. But it's like dirt cheap. If the gap insurance was $20 a month or something, this insurance might be like $4 a month. You're like, well then why would I pay for this other thing when this covers 80% of the risk at like 15% of the cost, right? It's just pointless. All right, now, but okay, on we go. Let's talk about saving for retirement. Okay. And saving in general. So if you have your little packet, I'm going to go, it at least highlights a lot of the key ideas. We're going to expound on them a lot. So let me grab this just so it will remind me of all the different things we want to talk about. So there's actually lots of reasons to save. It's not just about retirement, although that's a big piece of this. So we're going to talk generally about saving and investing, how you do it, how much you need, all those sorts of things. Okay, so first let's talk about different types of assets. These are places you might put your money. Some of them you're already very familiar with. So obviously there's cash or like cash equivalents. So you put money in a savings account, checking account, things like that. The downside is you don't really get much of any return off of it, but it's easily accessible. Like it's safe, it's sitting there. A lot of times it's actually insured by the federal government. So if someone, robs the bank, you still get your money up to a certain point. So the point is it's very secure, but you're not going to get any return off of it to speak of, but it's easy to access. You don't want to put tons of money here, but this is where you're going to put probably things that you need quick access to, right? Pay your current bills, things like that. All right, what's a stock? Stock is basically a share in the ownership of a company. So the idea is when you buy a share of stock, you're buying a portion of the ownership of the company. You're part owner of a company. So if a company has 1 million shares of stock out there in the world, and you own 10,000 of them, that's 100th of a million, you own 1/100th of the company. So this works, you own a fraction of it based on how many shares you own. Okay? Now, stocks are typically sold on markets. Now, there's stocks in companies that are private, so there are lots of little companies out there that they don't sell their stocks on the stock exchange. You can't just go out and buy stocks. Does that make sense? But there's lots of other companies, like big companies, where that's not true. You can definitely just go buy stocks. It's very easy to do. Okay? But a stock is in a particular company, and again, it's a part ownership. Now, over the long term, stocks average about, these are domestic stocks, so U.S. stocks, over a very, very long term, they average close to 10% rate of return. But what you got to understand about stocks is they're extremely volatile. On the best years of the last 100 and some years, they've gone up by like 30, 40% in a year. On the worst years, they've dropped 30+%. Okay? That's a lot of volatility. In fact, I saw something the other day. I didn't go back and double check the market data, but it didn't sound unreasonable. That said, over the entire history of the U.S. stock market, like 100 and some years, there are only like maybe 9 or 10 years, I'll get the exact number, where the return rate was between 5 and 10%. In other words, most of the time it's above or below that. So you might think 8%, 9% sounds like a very average amount. 10s may be really close to the literal average, but it's highly volatile. This year it's 15%. Next year it's 2%. The next year you lose 8%. The next year you gain 25%. It's all over the place year to year. Okay? With stocks, you get high risk but high reward, right? There's a high possibility of getting growth in your money over the long term, but you've got a lot of volatility year to year. If you need money tomorrow, you don't want to put it in a stock because you might lose it, right? If you need it 30 years from now, this is a pretty good place to put it because it's more likely to grow. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, corporate bonds, what are these things? A corporate bond, well, a bond in general is a loan. So when you purchase a bond, what you're basically doing is loaning money to somebody. And they're agreeing to pay you back that money, right? So when you buy a corporate bond, effectively what you're doing is making a loan to a company, and they agree to pay you back some interest on this. And there's different languages they use for these. Now, bonds are actually negotiable instruments. These are things that you can trade on the marketplace. And so the value at any given time is actually also tied to market effects. But it all originates as a loan. Someone originally says, I'll pay you X amount in, and in 10 years or however much in the future, you'll pay me back X amount. Okay? But then there's some value associated with that because someone might say, well, gosh, you gave them $1,000 and they said in 10 years they'll pay you $2,000. Based on the current interest rates and so forth, I think I'd give you $1,800 for that now because I don't think we'll get much somewhere else. Or man, everything else is doing great. I'm only going to give you $800 for that now. Now that you own it, I wouldn't give you that much for it because I can get a lot. Does this make sense? The actual value of it depends on market conditions. Over the long term, what you need to understand is they typically average about 6 to 7% return. Over a very long window of time, corporate bonds get about 6 to 7%. That's pretty good. It's not nearly as good as the 10% for stocks, but they're not as volatile. Now, they're still volatile, but not nearly as much. Their worst years, they might lose 5%, 8%, something like that. Their best years, they might gain 15 or 10%. Does that make sense? So they have a much narrower window of returns, okay? But they're not as good a return. All right, what about like government bonds, CDs? Okay, you probably heard about things like buying CDs and so forth. These are things that are typically much lower risk. A government bond's like you're basically loaning money to your local municipality or something, or the state or something, so they can go do some project. There, you got a lot of security. See, there's risk here because if you buy a bond from a company, it may not pay you back, right? There's some risk it may not pay you back. Now, there's a good reason they want to pay you back. All of these companies have to borrow money themselves so they can run their business and so forth. They have ratings, and a lot of the business they do are tied to their ratings. They get credit ratings, and if they say don't pay back bond owners, then bondholders, then what's going to happen is their ratings drop. And that's very bad for them. So there's reasons they want to make sure that they make good on these, right? But still, there's risk, especially if you buy from smaller companies or riskier companies. So there's still risk here. Government bonds, there's not so much risk. Probably City of Allen's going to pay you back in 2 years for that loan you made to them. These tend to be very low risk, but that means you're going to get low return. There's always a trade-off here. More risk usually means greater return possibility, but a lot more volatility. That's the idea. Lower risk, right? Less possible return. All right. What the heck's a mutual fund? So a mutual fund is basically a single item that you can purchase that is a collection of these things. So a mutual fund might include stocks in 60 different companies, for example. So when you buy a share of the mutual fund, you're actually buying a little piece of 60 different companies. See how that works? For example, a mutual fund might have 5% of its money invested in IBM and 7% invested in, some other company, in Aetna or something. And the idea is when you buy a share of the mutual fund, you're buying a share of sort of the collective value of everyone who's bought that, which is 6% here, 7% there. What this does for you by a mutual fund is it lets you very easily diversify. Okay, so diversification is this idea that because there's risk associated with all these things, you don't want all your eggs in one basket, so to speak. You don't want to go out and put all your money in Ford because Ford might have a great year or might have a terrible year. Does that make sense? And you don't even want to put all your money in the automotive industry, like buy Ford and buy Nissan and buy Honda, because the whole automotive industry will tend to move together. Typically, when I talk about the risk associated with these and in different stocks and various types of securities, usually you can sort of view it as there is some volatility that's tied to just the marketplace at large. Then there's a certain amount that's associated with sort of the sector that it's in. Is it in a healthcare sector? Is it an energy sector? Everything in a certain sector will tend to go up or down together. But then within that sector, there may be variance tied to that particular company. This company did well or did poorly. And all of these things together sort of make up the volatility. So you don't want to just buy one thing. You don't even want to just buy stuff in one sector. You want to buy a whole bunch of different things across lots of different areas. Does that make sense? That way, when this goes up and this one goes down, on average, they kind of net out. Does that make sense? That's the idea. So that's the idea of diversification. Okay, mutual funds give you a very easy way to do this because you could buy one fund and suddenly own 100 different things across a whole bunch of different areas. Funds can also include bonds. There are funds that consist of bonds. There are funds that consist of a combination of bonds and stocks. I mean, you could really diversify. Okay, there's U.S. stocks, but there's also stocks of international companies. And you can buy funds that include stocks that are international, that are domestic, that are large companies, small companies across all the different sectors, that include bonds that basically diversify across everything. It's possible to even do it in even just a single mutual fund. A single mutual fund can essentially diversify everything for you. They offer these things. Okay. Now, let's talk about active versus passive investing. This is a really important point, okay? Active investing means you're going to go out there, or you're going to have somebody else go out there for you, some expert, like your stockbroker or something, or whoever runs the mutual fund you buy, right? You buy one from Fidelity, whoever runs that, the fund manager, and you're banking on your ability or their ability to basically make really good choices. They'll pick the good stocks that'll outperform the market, okay? That's active. Active investing is sort of like gambling, in a sense. Like you're sort of betting that you can beat everybody else, right? There's millions, billions of people out there who are investing and like, I can do better than them, or my expert's better than their expert, okay? Passive investing is different. Passive investing says, I'm not going to try to beat the market at large. I'm just going to try to match it. If the market goes up by 8%, I'm happy with 8%. I'm not going to try to get 10 because I know I'm trying to get 10, I might get 4. I'm happy with passive investing. See how this works? Now, a lot of people are like, why in the world would you ever do passive investing? Why not try to do better? Here's the answer. Passive investments, that usually refers to what's called indexing. There are funds you can buy called an index fund. And the idea of an index fund is it tries to match the broad marketplace return. Say, well, how do they do that? It's actually really easy. Okay. Let's say that of all the stocks out there, 30% are in healthcare. I'm making numbers. 20% are in energy. 15% are in automotive. So what they do is they go make sure that 30% of their money is in a handful of the biggest companies in medical, in the healthcare. And 15% is in automotive. You get the idea? And lo and behold, if the overall marketplace has a return for the year of 9.7%, that index fund probably somewhere between 9.6 and 9.8. It pretty much matches. See? That's all they do. Now you say, why is there a benefit to this? Because you can have a computer make those calls. What happens is when you're talking about passive investing like indexes, you don't incur a lot of fees. Your expert who's going to be so smart and get all this money for you by making good choices, they're going to expect some return for that. So what happens is if you buy a mutual fund that is actively managed, it means there's going to be what's called an expense ratio associated. Expense ratio is like a fraction of all the fund holdings that are used to run the fund. Well, for actively managed funds, the expense ratio averages about 1.5%. That means 1.5% of all the money in that fund, of everybody who's invested per year, gets used to run the fund. Where does that go? A lot of it goes into the pocket of the fund holder who gets really rich. Okay? So the fund manager, I should say. What about your passive funds, like index funds? Well, a lot of them have expense ratios of about 0.1% or 0.2%, like almost nothing. So here's what happens. If you go with active investing, you might beat the average, or you might not, okay? But what you are going to do is spend a lot more money having the thing run. There's studies that have been done now, quite a few, and it's pretty amazing. What they find is, if you look at a large enough window of time, pretty much no active funds beat the average when you account for expenses. Let me explain why. In order to beat the market average consistently, you have to be better at picking things than everybody else is. Here's the problem. There's literally tens of thousands of brilliant people out there with their PhDs and their computers calculating things constantly, trying to make the right choices. You follow what I'm saying? It's hard to be any better than all of them. How is your expert going to be better than their expert? And here's the other piece of this. Even if they were, how would you know? If you randomly pick 10 stocks, there's about a 50% chance that those 10 will outperform the average of the market, and about a 50% chance they'll underperform. If a monkey picks them, there's also about a 50% chance. So you don't know if the fact that for the last 5 years, this fund manager has had really good performance is due to them having a really great acumen, or if it's sheer luck. If you have 1,000 different fund managers, half of them are going to outperform the average. See how this works? And over 5 years, maybe half of them will still outperform the average overall. What happens is they get closer. If it's actively managed, what you're going to do is pay that 1.5% extra every year, though. Okay? What happens if you look over the long range is over I forget the exact numbers, but I'm going to approximate. This is pretty close. I think it's over like a 10-year period. When they look at all actively managed funds versus index funds, only about 20%, maybe it's less, 15%, have actually outperformed an index fund over like 10 years. If you go out to 20 years, it's like 2 or 3%. You can just imagine. If you go out to 30 years, it'd be like nothing. See? Because it's like gambling. You might do better. It's like throwing the dice. Hey, I did better this year. Yay! And you throw the dice again. But every time you throw the dice, you're paying 1.5% out. Right? So what's really interesting here is I think long ago, most people would say, well, it's really silly to not try to beat the market. Now, most experts will tell people, don't even bother. Now, I say that. You got to understand that a lot of people have a vested interest in this, right? The whole cottage industry of having stockbrokers and mutual fund managers is tied to this idea that they can outsmart everybody, and they make a whole lot of money selling this idea, okay? But what I'm telling you is, and I don't claim to be an expert on this, but I will tell you that if you just go Google it and you look into this stuff, you will find that most people now will tell the typical investor not to bother. Not to bother. In fact, whenever I was looking at this, I remember I found, it was really funny, I found a pros versus cons where they took two different sort of, financial experts, and one was supposed to argue the pro side of active investing, one was supposed to argue the pro side of indexing, the passive investing. And the guy that did the passive investing pointed to all the statistics that show a long run, you'd be an idiot to not passively invest because you do better. And the person who did active investing said, All the statistics say this is a bad idea, and it probably is. But let me tell you why. Maybe you do it anyways because, hey, maybe you'll do better. It was like, well, that's a very poor argument for why you should do this. Right? They basically conceded the point that it was a bad idea, but then said, but maybe you just want a chance that you'll do better. So put most of your stuff in stuff that's passing, and then actively invest a little bit. Maybe you'll do better. It's like, well, that was okay. Okay, I think I see which way I should go at this point. The bottom line here is, there may truly be a few people out there that are truly much better at this than everybody else. But if your job isn't in this industry, and even if it is in this industry, all the stats show probably these people don't exist. And if they do, how are you going to know who they are? You'd have to have so many years of data to tell for sure that it wasn't chance that they're outperforming, that at that point your investment window's done, right? You're done investing. You follow me? Plus, just because someone's better over these 5 years doesn't mean they're better over the next 5 years. Maybe they had something these 5 years that now everyone else is caught up to. Right? You follow? So what you do know for sure is, if you go active, you're going to spend an extra 1.5% every year to pay someone to do this for you. See how this works? Instead of getting 10%, you're getting 8.5% on average. See? So anyway, you can do as you wish. People who really like the gambling side of this, the risk-taking side, will go active. But long-term, all the studies show actually they lose out. Long-term, you're going to be worse off. You're like, well, how much worse off is it? It's 1.5%. A lot worse off. If you invest $1 right now, right, and you look at how much it's worth 30 years from now, here, let's grab this is a simple calculation. Let's do 1.1, that's 10% return to the 30th power. It's worth $17.40. Let's do 8.5% compounded over 30 years. It's worth $11.50. You have half again as much money 30 years later by getting that extra 1.5% every year. So this works. Compounded over a long period of time, those expenses add up. They add up a lot. So one of the things you want to make sure you do when you're investing is minimize all your costs. You got to minimize the costs. You don't invest in things if they have high expense ratios. That's pointless. I'm just wasting money. Okay? If you don't have to, you don't pay someone to run your stuff for you because they're going to expect a chunk of it. Now, if you feel really uncomfortable and it's worth it to you to do that, then feel free to do so. But as I'm going to show you in a second, it's possible to do this on your own very easily, actually. I mean, you can do something as simple as investing in a single mutual fund, and it will completely diversify and shift everything around for you based on when you're going to retire. And it's basically brainless at that point. Okay? All right, let's keep going. Okay. All right, so now, emergency funds. Let me give you some advice right off the bat here. You get out of college, you get your first job, right? And you're like, I'm ready to start saving. What do I want to save for? Where do I put money? What do I do? Okay. The very first thing you need to do is put money aside for a rainy day. You might lose your job. Your car might break down. Lots of things can and do happen. Reasonably good advice is to have 6 months worth of money aside. You need enough money to live off for 6 months. It will take you a while to save that. But I would say that's the first thing you want. You want to make sure right off the bat that you have emergency funds. Before you worry about saving for other things, you need emergency funds. Okay? And you want to go for about 6 months worth of expenses. Right off the bat, you want to try to get that. Now, can this be in investments like stocks and stuff? Yeah, but just know that if they're in things like that that have high volatility, that they might drop in value. They might rise in value too, but there's some risk. Okay, so depending on your situation, you might be a little bit more or less risky with this. You might not just want it in cash because that just sits flat pretty much while everything else inflates in value. But maybe you like it in stuff that is not super risky. Does this make sense? Now, eventually, if you've got a whole bunch of money, you're 20 years down the line and you have $500,000 saved up in investments, you probably don't have to worry as much about this because you can access some of that stuff. But at the beginning, you're going to need that money possibly, and you want to make sure you have emergency funds. Okay? All right. Retirement. This is usually the next big place you got to save. All right. So how much will you need? The answer is a lot, but exactly what a lot is depends exactly on when you're going to retire, how good you want your retirement to be, what source of retirement you have, and I actually set up a little calculator so I can show you how this works, okay? Let me give you some basic advice. So for those retiring around 65 that are drawing Social Security, which you may not be able to make, we'll talk about Social Security in a second, okay? Do you guys know what Social Security is? Social Security is sort of like a pension, but not really. So anyone, there are a few exceptions, but if you go and you work a job, you're going to have taxes withheld from your paycheck, typically. And there are a few exceptions for this, for Social Security. They'll hold out, I think it's about 5.5%. I forget the exact, but some amount, okay? The idea is that money gets paid into the government under Social Security. Now, by contributing to Social Security, you now become eligible at a certain age to draw from Social Security. So the idea is you work for 30 or 40 years and you pay in. When you reach a certain age, and by the way, the age right now for people who are quite young, they keep shifting it, right? The earliest age you can draw Social Security if you're a fairly young person, so forward looking, and of course it's always subject to change, is 62. If you draw at 62 though, you don't get the benefit. You get a reduced benefit. To get the full benefit, you'd have to be 67. Okay? It used to be like 63 or so, they just keep shifting it. Okay? So for you guys, it's probably a reasonable guesstimate that you're going to have to be 67 to get the full benefit. You draw at 62, you get 70% of the benefit. Because they're giving you the money for more time, so they're not going to give you as much. See how this works? Okay? Now, how much are we talking about here? Well, I pulled it up during my off period, and I did a quick calculation for you. Here's a little estimation here that I found. I got this off the Social Security website. For someone who makes $100,000 a year, I just picked a round number, basically, in equivalent to today's dollars. The actual values you would get would be bigger, but everything costs more too because of inflation. So this is equivalent to today's dollars. If you retire at 62, you get $23,000 a year. You wait till 67, you get $33,000 a year. Now, this is on the assumption that you made this amount. If you made half of this, I believe the numbers were about 2/3 as big. They scale with this, but they're not exactly in proportion. Does this make sense? Okay? So if you make less, you pay in less, and you get less. But it doesn't go exactly in proportion how much you put in. All right? Now, here's the thing. Social Security is a system that's going to fail. Okay? In other words, they're going to have to, it's not going to stay like this. And here's why. Social Security is not actually like a pension. Like if you go pay into a government pension or something like that, the idea is people invest money and it gets invested somewhere. And that money goes somewhere and it's somewhere safe and it grows. And then you use this money that has grown to pay out the people when it's time to collect. That's not how Social Security works. The way Social Security works is they take in the tax dollars and they don't save a penny of it. And using current year's tax dollars, they pay out whoever needs Social Security. When they started Social Security, relatively few people drew from it and lots of people paid in, so it worked great. Now there's lots of people who are old enough to draw Social Security, who have a lot that they need to get, and there are not necessarily in proportion as many payers. And so what's happening is you have a system where Social Security might have made up 5 or 10% or some small percentage of all the tax revenues collected by the federal government 40 years ago. Now, I forget the percentage, but it might be like 30% or 40%. In other words, it's taking up a bigger and bigger chunk. It's not sustainable. Does this make sense? It's not sustainable. The money doesn't get invested. They only pay people today based on what they take in. So this is not a sustainable system. What that means is, in order to try to deal with this, there's a reasonably good probability that by the time you're old enough to retire, you would not get this. There's a reasonably good, I wouldn't say it's all going to disappear because a lot of people don't save anything. So they probably wouldn't just completely get rid of this. What they're going to do is they're going to keep moving the age back when you can draw it, and then they're going to decrease the amount you get, and they're going to increase the percentage you pay in, or they're going to do a variety of these things to try to make it a little more secure. But I would not count on, when you're only 17 years old or 18 years old, getting this 40 years down the line, 50. It's probably not going to be there. Might you get something? Yeah, maybe you can count on getting half of that. Does that make sense? You'll probably get something, but you can't really rely on this. Does this make sense? If you're retired right now, yeah, you're probably going to get whatever you're getting. Now, keep in mind, the other thing to do with Social Security is everything gets more expensive, right? Every year things inflate. They do adjust the benefit. Well, that's another thing they can toy around with. If inflation's 3%, they might only give people who are drawing Social Security 1% more next year. Things like that. But then you're really getting less value and real ability to spend. Does this make sense? One way or the other, I wouldn't count on getting this 40 or 50 years from now because it's just not a sustainable system as is. Does that make sense? You're probably not going to get all this. Okay. All right. So now we get to how much do I need to save? I made this quick calculator while you guys are. By the way, I highly recommend, if you're interested in knowing how this stuff works, to take some class on financial accounting at some point, on finance, and handling cash flows, and so forth. Because I took a class, and that's how I learned how to do all these calculations. So I set up all my own calculators. One class was enough, right? And I now know how all this stuff works. Here's the idea. Let's say you wanted to start saving at 30, and you wanted to retire at 62, right? And boy, you do not want to run out of money. So you say, maybe I'm going to live to be 90, right? I'm sort of going to err on the high side because I don't want to run out, okay? Now, this adjusted rate of return is basically how much return you get on whatever you're saving, but I adjusted it for inflation. You say, well, how did you do that? Well, let me show you how this works. Let's say that your actual rate of return is 8.5%, okay? So in a year, $1 saved is worth $1.085. Well, let's say inflation is 3%. That's a very average rate. The actual value then is that divided by 1.03. You would take $1.03 to have the equivalent buying power of $1 today. Well, if you take a calculator, you divide 1.085 by 1.03, you get something that's really close to 1.055. For these small numbers, here I'll do it, 1.085 divided by 1.03 is 1.053, okay? So when you're trying to do approximations, and that's all we're doing right now is approximating things, you can roughly adjust for inflation, because it's just a lot easier to think about dollars today, because I don't know how much things cost. It's just easier to think about today's dollars. You can roughly do this by just subtracting the inflationary rate from your rate of return, and you get something that's in today's dollars. Does that make sense? So the idea is, imagine that in terms of real value, whatever you invest today is worth 5.5% more next year. Okay? It's actually grown by more than that, but everything else costs more too. It's really worth this much more. Does that make sense? That way you can think about everything costing the same as it does today. Okay? All right. This is your return rate after retirement. So why don't I use a smaller number? Well, here's the idea. If you're investing and you got 30 years until you retire or what have you, you've got such a long window that you can withstand some ups and downs. That means you're more likely to do things like invest heavily in stocks. Why? Because stocks have bigger return rates, but there's a lot more volatility. Right? But hey, I can take that risk. I can risk that I'm going to lose 20% this year because I might gain 25% the next year. Long term, there's a big rate of return. So I'll invest heavily in things like stocks that are very volatile if I have a long window. See how this works? If I'm now retired, I'm not going to invest in stuff that's, at least as a proportion, that's as volatile because I need that money now, right? I'm going to need that money next year or 2 years from now. I don't have 30 years to wait. So what's going to happen is you're going to shift the makeup of your savings. So when you're 30, you might put almost everything in stocks if you don't mind the risk, right? When you're 50, you're not going to do that probably. Or when you're 60, it might be 30% stocks and 70% corporate bonds. Or so, you follow me? Like it's going to be very differently. Okay. And if you're already 80, you're probably 10% stocks, 50% corporate bonds or something, and 40% in like government bonds, really low. It all depends on how soon you need that money. All right, so this might be like having about 8.5% or a little bit more rate of return before inflation, the idea. And I'm doing this after tax. So just imagine that you get 9.5%, it's mostly stocks, maybe, something like that. You lose a little bit for taxes. We'll talk about how there's ways to not lose as much. And then you knock off inflation. This is probably a fairly reasonable return rate. Okay. All right. By the way, you actually don't pay taxes on the growth until you sell your stock. So it's growing tax-free, basically, until you sell it. That makes sense? You're not realizing the growth until you sell it. Okay. In general, for just like growth in the market value. Okay. Now, this is a smaller rate of return. This might be like getting 7.5% pre-tax at retirement. Maybe you pay 1%, about 14% of that off as taxes. You're down to 6.5%, and then you knock off 3% for inflation. So I'm ballparking. These are fairly reasonable. Okay, fairly reasonable. Look at what happens. Number one, and when you're retired, a lot of times you can cut your costs a little bit, but you still need a decent amount, right? Look at what you're going to need. In equivalent to today's dollars, you would need $1,060,000 at age 62. It's actually going to be a bigger number. These are in today's dollars. The real number is quite a bit larger, but your real growth rate would be bigger. Does that make sense? Okay. Now that's about 17 to 18 times what you need per year. That's the idea. Okay. How do you pull this off? You're going to have to put about $12,800 a year, which is about 12.8% of what you're making. See how this works? Now, what happens if I tweak these numbers? What happens if you don't get any Social Security? Like, I need 80,000 here then, right? I want $80,000 a year because I'm not going to get that $20,000 that I thought I might get from Social Security. Okay. Now, if you need $80,000, you're going to have to save 17%. See, that's getting pretty substantial. See, well, what happens if I start a little earlier, right? I start when I'm 25, and I work till I'm 65. Okay, now I'm down to needing to put 10% aside. You see, this stuff changes a lot depending on when you retire and when you start saving. Now, let's say you do something really dumb, and you say, I'm young, I don't need to worry about this. I'm going to wait till I'm 45 to start saving. I'm going to retire when I'm 65. Great, put 38% aside every year, and you'll get there. You see why you don't want to wait, right? That's a really bad idea. You say, I'll wait till I'm 55. I mean, if I'm 10 years from now, that's when you start worrying about it, right? You wait till you're 10 years away. Great. Just put 102% of what you're never going to get there, right? So guess what you do? You make this number smaller, you retire a lot older, you live a meager life, and you work until, you're practically dead. You don't want that to happen, right? So the way you avoid this is you save a fairly substantial amount, but you start early. The earlier you start, the less as a fraction it has to be. It's still not inconsequential, right? Even if you start when you're 25. For a lot of people, that's a pretty reasonable age. Think about it. If you go to college, you get out when you're 22, and then you take a couple of years to do things like save up your emergency funds, right? Maybe at 25, you start really, hopefully you start even earlier, but maybe around, of course, if you go to grad school, this might get pushed back, but hopefully your income also went up, right? And you retire at 65, right? Then you can see what's going to happen here. It's more like 10% you have to save. That's still a lot. Most people don't save anywhere close to 10% of what they earn. Nowhere close, which is why most people are screwed, right? They don't save anywhere close to that. Now, the good news is people who are near retire right now can probably count on at least getting that Social Security. That's not a lot, though. If that's all you have, and for a lot of people, that's all they have. Notice how at retirement, you still are going to need that 16.5 times multiple, right, to live for this. We're only living 25 years off of this. So we need a 16.5 times multiple. Most people in retirement have like a one-time multiple. Like they have like nothing. They're living on Social Security and a couple of pennies like that. You know what I mean? They're not supplementing much. They don't have much. Okay? Now, with all this in mind, you're like, this is frightening. It's not if you're smart, okay? So let me give you a couple of pieces of advice right off the bat. The best way to make sure that you actually save a reasonable amount is to start right away. If you get used to living off of all the money you make, you will just continue doing that and you will spend every penny. That's what most people do, right? You say, I'll worry about putting money aside in year 3. Never mind, I said maybe you've worked a few years, but you're putting money aside already. You're putting money for emergency funds. You're still pulling money aside. If you don't start putting aside, you're just going to increase your lifestyle. You'll have a more expensive car, a more expensive house, and it's all gone. And you'll have no idea how you could ever save any money. How could I ever put aside this money? My lifestyle was this, right? Keep in mind, I haven't even put aside any money for things like if you have a kid and they got to go to college. I'll talk about that in a second. You're going to save more if you're going to do that, okay? At least if you don't want to say good luck to you. If you want to actually have some money, then you're going to have to save more for that, okay? Now, is this an impossible task? No, it is not impossible. Now, obviously, the more money you have, the easier this is going to be, right? The more income you make, the easier this is. But even if you don't have a large income, it's still doable because probably if your income's not that big, you can get by on less money or you're used to spending less. Does that make sense? So to some extent, it scales up. The percentage doesn't necessarily change that appreciably. This is not an impossible feat, but what I will tell you is when you're young, you're probably going to have less things that you have to pay for in general, okay? When you're a young person and you're not, married, or even you're married, you don't have any kids, maybe you haven't bought a house yet, you don't have all these things that are going to take giant chunks of your income. That's the time to get in the habit of putting a giant amount aside, okay? I'm going to suggest that you put somewhere around 10 to 15% a year aside, somewhere around there. That seems to give you a pretty good chance here of being in good shape. That is possible, but you got to start early to pull that off. At the very beginning, if you can put more, you put more. Because here's the thing. 6 years later, when you've got 2 kids and they're in daycare and you're spending $25,000 a year on daycare, you're not going to be able to probably match that 10 to 15%, right? You might only be able to put 7% that year. But the good news is if you put 25% a few years ago, it had a longer period to grow. See? Those early dollars are worth way more than those late dollars are because they've grown for a lot longer. I can tell you in my wife and I's case, we had kind of a very unusual circumstance. I'm going to tell you this is a typical circumstance. But, she and I both grew up pretty poor. But then when we got out of law school, we didn't have help from parents, really. Not much of anything to speak of. So we pretty much paid our way through college. We had giant law school debts. We had some credit card debt that helped us get through. We got out, but we both got jobs. We went to top 10 law school. And we both got jobs at big law firms, which tend to be at the top of the market pay. And at that time, most of the firms paid and this was 15 years ago. They paid, I don't know, $120,000 a year or something right out of law school. But then a few years, they jumped that up to $160,000 a year. Okay? That's probably $200,000 or more today. We were both, young. We didn't have any kids. We weren't used to having money. Right? We didn't go out and buy BMWs. We bought a Honda Accord, right? We bought a house, but we didn't go out and buy a mansion. We bought a decent house. And we said, you know what? We're probably never going to make money like this ever again. And we're pretty sure we might not like our jobs. So we're going to save like crazy. And we were in a very unusual situation where our incomes were really, really high. And we weren't used to having money. And we saved like crazy. Sometimes I think we had some years we saved 6 figures in a year. We're going to put giant sums aside. But you put that money aside when you're 24, you got a long time for it to grow. See, it makes a big difference. Now, I realize not everyone's going to be in exactly that position, but the point I'm hitting at is when you're younger, you're going to have less of those costs. It's going to be easier to put a bigger fraction aside. You may think that's not true, but it is. Once you have the house and the cars and the kids in daycare or private school or what have you, it's very hard to start making changes. Does that make sense? So before you get to that point, you got to start putting money aside. And when I say average 10 to 15% per year, that's great. What I really mean when you're young, if you can do better than that, right? Save more than that. Because you're going to have a point down the road where you're making tough choices, like to put that 10% a year, I can't send such and such to this daycare that I think is better than that daycare. But if you put 25% a few years ago, then maybe you can go ahead and do that. See how this works? So you got to start really young with these things. Most people don't do that. Most people just spend everything. And then they get to like the age 45 or 50 and they're like, I guess I should start thinking about retirement, and they're screwed. Right? Then they think, I got to start thinking about paying for my kids' college. You better worry about your retirement first, right? Because you're going to have to live. And it's already too late for that. So your kids also end up screwed. So hopefully they're really smart and they get a big scholarship. And I mean, this is the problem that most Americans run into. And so the way you avoid this is you have to start early and you have to save a lot. Not a little bit, not pennies, you save a lot. Okay, so now where do you put it? All right, so let me show you where you put this money, okay? All right, so let's talk about, we talked about how much you have to save, right? Kind of reasonable ideas, okay? What the heck's a 401k? What's an IRA? Okay, so everyone's probably heard of a 401k before or an IRA. These are names for special retirement funds. So the idea is the federal government has set up these various systems to try to give people incentives to save for retirement. And how they give you incentives, they give you tax benefits. One of them is under like Article 401k of some code. That's why it's called a 401k. Here's the way a 401k works. When you take a job, everyone is allowed, if their employer says it, your employer has to actually set up 401ks, but most employers do. Most of them have setups. What happens is, if your employer has set up a 401k, then employees of that company can now place money, invest money into the 401k. Now, when you invest it, you actually get to pick from a variety of investment options. And the options depend on the company. Every company will pick different vendors to run their 401ks. One picks Fidelity, one picks Vanguard, one picks something else. And they're going to have different options. Does this make sense? So your options are really dictated by what the company's chosen. But most of them, if it's a big company or whatever, they're going to have a lot of options. Okay, obviously out of those, you want to try to find things that have low expense ratios, things that are, and so forth. You get the idea. You want to be diverse and you want low costs. Okay. Now, you get to put in a 401k. I put $18,000 per year. This was like a year ago. I double checked. I think That was for 2018. I think next year it's like 18,500. Most years they up it by like $500 a year. They increase it a little bit. This is the cap on how much you can put in per year for an individual. If you're married, you can put in twice that because each person can fund it. Now, what happens when you put money into a 401k is you get to deduct whatever you put in from your income when you do your taxes. So if your income's $100,000 and you put $18,000 in, then when you go do your taxes, it's as if you only made $82,000. So what you're doing is saving taxes on the money you put in. Now, the trade-off is when you eventually pull that money out, you have to pay taxes not only on the growth, but also the original amount you put in. So why would I do this then? Well, because for most people, they're making more money now than they will at retirement, and so they'll pay a higher tax rate now than later. They're saving taxes when their tax rate's higher, and they're paying taxes when the tax rate's lower. So there's an advantage here. Okay. Now, if you make you have tons of money in savings, maybe that's not so true. But for a lot of people, that's the advantage to this. Now, there are some drawbacks. When you put money in your 401k, you can't just go touch it. Okay. Say you've been putting $12,000 aside a year for the last 6 years, and it's been growing, and you got $140,000 in there. And you're like, I can't just go use that. No, you can't. Okay. If you withdraw money from the 401k, you pay penalties. You'll pay like a 10% penalty of whatever you take off right off the bat. You just lose it. It's just a fine, basically. It's to disincentivize people from taking money out of the retirement. That's the idea. So you pay a penalty right off the bat. You also pay taxes, and so basically you don't put money in there if you think you're going to have to touch it. Does that make sense? It's for when you retire. Once you reach, I think for a 401k, I believe now the year you're allowed to pull, it's either 59 and a half or 55. I think it's 55. I think at 55, you can pull whatever you want from 401k without any fees, but not until you're that age. An IRA is kind of the same thing. It stands for an individual retirement account. This one is not actually run through a company. So even if your company doesn't offer 401k, you can still get one of these, and you can actually do both. You can have two different ones. You can do a 401k and an IRA. The individual one is not set up through the company. You just go set that up yourself. You contact Fidelity, Vanguard, wherever, you set one up. Okay? And you're free to use any number of different types of investments. If you want to invest in things like mutual funds and stocks, which you probably do, if you have a long window, you want some growth, then you go contact Vanguard or Fidelity or some company like this, right? Merrill Lynch or what have you, and you go set up your account. And then you put money in. And by the way, a lot of this gets really simple. Now that we have so much stuff set up over the web, all you really have to do is link it up so that your checking account or whatever your account is linked there so that it can every month pull an X amount out of your account. 401k actually comes out of your paycheck, right? Before you even get the money, it comes out. You never touch it. Does that make sense? IRA doesn't go through your work. So you get your paycheck and then you go put it in. But it kind of works the same way. With an IRA, you get a tax deduction now, but then you pay tax on everything later. There's actually a different kind of IRA that's called a Roth IRA. There's two different. There's one called the traditional. Traditional one works very much like a 401k. A Roth one, you pay taxes right now, just like you normally would. In other words, you don't get the deduction, okay? But you never pay taxes on any of it at the end. In other words, it's all tax-free at the end, including the growth. That's pretty awesome. You can't get a Roth, though, unless your income is below a certain level. So if your income gets really high, you won't qualify for a Roth. But what's interesting is all this is based on a year, and throughout your life, you'll go through cycles, right? And sometimes there's ways where you can sort of game the system. Like I'll give you an example. A few years ago, my wife and I, quickly quit being lawyers, and we decided to become teachers, and we took time off. We already had a lot of money set aside. Well, the government set up an allowance for people to, at that moment, convert from one type of IRA to another. To do that, you had to pay the taxes right then, but that was based on your current income level. Well, our income level that year was like close to nothing, right? So I had to convert as much as I could over. I'll pay taxes at 10% right now, and I'll never pay taxes again on that money I just converted. See how this works? So lots of times there are ways, if you're savvy at least, and you pay attention, where there'll be chances to do things like that. Does that make sense? But all of these things like 401ks and IRAs are basically places you can put investment funds that have certain tax advantages. But then there's going to be certain constraints on your ability to touch that money. You cannot touch that until a certain point in time. And there's usually some ways out. Like, for example, for an IRA, you can pull money out early to pay for your kid's college, for example, without any fees. Certain medical expenses, you can pull money out. Things like that. If you retire really early, like at 50, I think for both of these, you can set up an annuity, which basically means every year you withdraw an even amount They use some sophisticated system based on your life expectancy to figure out exactly how much you should pull out for the rest of your life. And as long as you pull out exactly that, then you don't pay any withdrawal fees because you're retiring early, basically. But in general, you can't just go take out $12,000 without paying a bunch of fees. Okay, so that's what these things are. All right, I talked about college for kids. Man, this one's all over the place. I did a calculation for you because this really depends on how much the college costs, how much scholarship is over you get, how long you invest for. I mean, it's hard to give a good solid number here, but college costs have generally risen about 5% per year, which means they increase at a rate that exceeds general inflation. In real value, college costs more every year. Does that make sense? Everything else goes up by 2 or 3%. College is going up by more than that. Okay. Now, will that continue? I don't know. It used to be 7%. It's not as bad as it once was, but it's still pretty darn bad. Now, I did a quick calculation. If you assume a 5% increase per year, and you wanted to save equivalent of $120,000 today, that's like 4 years at $30,000 a year. That's roughly the cost of going to like University of Texas for 4 years, in the right ballpark. You would actually need a little over $300,000 in 20 years. That's actually because of the growth in the price because of inflation. To get to that number, if you saved for 20 years, you'd have to put $7,000 a year aside for 20 years. Obviously, if you started earlier, you'd need less. That's maybe one kid if you're trying to pay for everything. Now, if your kid gets a full ride, then you don't have any problems here. If you're not willing to pay for them, then I guess good for you and bad for them. But like I said, there's a lot of volatility here. I would say probably if you save somewhere around per child about 3% per year of your income, that will probably get you at least in the right ballpark. But you got to kind of tweak that depending on where they go in circumstances. That's a rough approximation. So if I was at 10 to 15% before, you got 2 kids, you're up to 20% a year you need to put aside. But it's going to be harder to put 20% aside when you got 2 kids because your expenses just went up. Okay, so you want to start early. Early, put more aside if you can. Those dollars are worth more because they have longer to grow. Okay, all right, let's keep going. Let's see. Couple of quick tips for you. Okay, so start early. Have contributions automatically taken out so you don't have to worry about spending the money. Like 401k, that's going to happen, right? They'll get pulled out immediately. Otherwise, have it automatically get pulled into your investment accounts. If you touch the money, odds are you're going to spend the money. Does that make sense? You're going to spend the money. Diversify. You do not want everything in one area. You want to own stocks. If you're young, you might want mostly stocks. If you don't mind the risk, get a long investment window. But even then, some people aren't willing to risk it. Like it just breaks their heart to see it go like this, right? And that can happen. Just before my wife and I just quit being lawyers, we'd saved a substantial amount aside, realizing we were going to probably quit. And that's when the market tanked. Okay? Market dropped by about 60%. Our stuff is worth 40% as much. Here's the thing. If you look historically, times when the market drops a lot, within a couple of years, it has its best years. If you go sell everything after it's dropped by 50% because you're now afraid of the loss, and you stay out until it goes back up, you lost the growth when it went back up. You've got to be willing to stay with it to some extent. Does that make sense? If you say, well, I'll just wait until it stops dropping. How are you going to know that? If you can look after the fact, I can be like, well, this is the day it stops. No one knows that in advance, or no one would be in at that point. Does that make sense? No one knows. Here's the good news. If you're constantly investing, then when it drops, you're buying stuff pretty cheap. So when everything dropped, my wife and I said, let's work about another year then. Let's save a little bit longer. And I worked really hard one year and I got a giant bonus. It's about what I make now in a year. And I invested 100% of it right in. Market had already dropped like 60%. I put every penny in the stock market. A couple of years later, when the stock market's back to where it used to be, that's more than doubled in price in a couple of years. The rate of return on that was enormous, right? It kind of makes up for the other stuff that dropped a lot. As long as you keep investing, then when things drop, hey, at least you're buying cheap with some other things, right? You just get afraid, you quit, then you're in trouble. If you go sell off, you've just lost all of that. So you got to be willing to kind of stick with your gun. If you're gonna go with stocks, you better stick with them. That's the idea. All right. Some mutual funds have what are called loads. That means like there's fees that you pay. You don't want that. You want a no-load mutual fund. There's lots of them, right? You don't want to start giving money away for nothing, right? Keep costs and taxes really low. Look at expense ratios. That information is always given. You want low expense ratios. I don't know if my wife and I have a single investment with an expense ratio above maybe 0.5%. And the overall average is about 1.5% for across the market. A A lot of our stuff, I think our overall expense ratio is like 0.2%. I'm not going to waste my money, right, by having someone else try to make good choices. What all the stats say they're not going to be able to pull it off over the long run. I'm going to keep costs low by buying things like indexes. And you can index everything. You can index the U.S. funds, small funds, international funds. You can index whatever you want. You can diversify and still be indexed, right? And you're just saying, look, I'm good enough with the average return in these sectors minus 0.1% of expenses versus trying to beat it but losing 1.5%, right? You want to buy and hold for the long term. Like I said, don't jump ship. Keep enough money in non-retirement accounts to cover emergencies because you can't just touch that without paying fees, right? And then sometimes employers will have matching funds. Like they'll say, we'll match dollar for dollar or 50 cents on the dollar or something when you contribute to 401k. It's like free money. You make sure you invest whatever the matching amount is, guaranteed. Even if you're going to put money somewhere else, make sure you get the matching money. Now, a lot of times that doesn't vest, like you don't actually own it until you've worked there for 3 years or what have you, but still, that's like free money. Like you make sure you get the matching when it's available. All right, now I told you I would show you very quickly how it's possible if you're feeling overwhelmed, like how would you ever figure out how to invest in something? I want to show you how easy this is, okay? I happen to like Vanguard a lot. My wife and I have money in a lot of different places, but I happen to like Vanguard because it was one of the pioneers in indexing, and it has a bazillion options, and if you invest money there, you go set up an account, a lot of times you pay no fees on the account. So there may be a little expense for the funds, but there's no additional fee to have the account. As long as you don't have like a manager there or a stockbroker run your stuff. Like as long as you don't pay someone to run your stuff, or you're not paying any fees out. Does that make sense? Other than the little bit associated with funds. All right, they have funds here that are called target retirement funds, and they've got years like This is Target Retirement 2015, Target Retirement 2020. What they've tried to do is make life really easy for people. If you know that I'm going to retire in 2055, let's say, then the idea is, let's pick a different. Let's say 2030. Say you're going to retire in 11 years. You could invest in this target retirement fund. And the idea is, let me show you what this does. Here's the allocation. By the way, here's the fees. Expense ratio, 0.14%. That sounds pretty good compared to the 1.5% globally, right? You're not just wasting money to have somebody run this for you, okay? Now, take a look at how it's allocated. 69.4%, and you guys can't read it, is in stock. Here, I'll zoom in, okay? It's got 69.4% stocks, 30.5% bonds. The short-term reserves is basically, there's a little cash setting aside because they got to buy stuff, so they can't invest in everything, right? They go break it down for you. What this really consists of is 41.7% is in the Vanguard Total Stock Market Index. This tries to index, basically, the entire U.S. stock market. Large stocks, large companies, small companies, it tries to index all of them and get the same return as the market. That's where 41% is. 27.7% is the total international stock. It's trying to index, basically, international stocks. 21% is the total bond market. It's trying to, again, index and average what all the bonds do, corporate bonds. See how this works? Okay, you're like, why does this matter? Remember we're talking diversification? These target funds, every 5 years or what have you, they automatically change the breakdown of how things are at so that if you buy one and your date to retire is 30 years from now, it might be 100% in various stocks between international and domestic. When you get to 20 years out or whatever, maybe it shifts to 90% stocks, 10% bonds. You get to 50%, maybe it's 70-30. In other words, something that you're supposed to do yourself, rearrange based on how long you have, it does automatically for you. You could just buy this one thing, and the reality is you will probably long-term see your funds be better diversified and have a better rate of return on it because there's low expenses than probably 99% of investors out there in the world. And it's not tough. You buy one thing. See how this works? One thing. It's actually possible to do this. Now, maybe you don't like the exact breakdown. If you don't like that, then fine, go buy your own stuff, right? But the point here is there are things out here that make this really easy. This doesn't have to be difficult. You can buy a single thing and it will automatically, boom, diversify everything and do it with low cost, index everything, and it will adjust everything for you and reallocate your funds between different types as you get older and your window changes, and it's simple as can be. This is not hard, right? All you got to do is log on to the website, figure out how to open up an account, which is usually not that difficult. You fill out some paperwork, maybe mail them a check. Then once you get in, you usually just set up automatic withdrawals or you link your account so you can transfer funds. And then boom, you're ready to go, right? That's all you have to do. You do a 401k, it wouldn't necessarily be through this. It'd be through whatever your company setup is. But you just tell it, automatically pull X amount out. The downside of the 401k is, like I said, you're kind of limited by what they offer. But most 401ks will at least have things like what's called like an S&P 500 index fund. That tries to index large stocks. So at least they often at least have that. So like for my wife and I, a lot of times for our 401k funds, we'll put it in that because they may not have a lot of other good things. They have some other good things like an international index. We might put some money there. And then, we'll, for other things, we'll put it over here. But what we're not going to do is go invest in some fund that's a 2% expense ratio. That's dumb. We're not going to do that. All right? That doesn't make any sense. But this doesn't have to be that hard. That's the point I'm making here. You don't need to go pay someone with their PhD a percent of whatever you have every year in order to run this for you. It doesn't have to be that hard, right? It's actually relatively simple. And the truth is, all of the studies show if you go pay someone that percent a year to run the stuff, in 30 years, you're going to have like half as much money. Like that's probably what's going to happen, is you're going to have a lot less because those expenses will add up over time. That's what's going to happen. All right, you guys have any questions? Did this help? Hopefully? Okay. All right, that's it. We're done.